Sometimes life is like Christmas morning. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing, where we'll discuss future and current U.S. leadership in commercial space. From the dawn of the space age, the private sector has worked hand in hand with the U.S. government. But it wasn't until the liftoff of the first privately funded space launch from the United States soil in 1982 that the nation's commercial space industry truly took off. As industry has grown and evolved over time, Congress enacted several pieces of space legislation to promote commercial space activities while upholding the international obligations of the United States. This legislation granted the executive branch regulatory authority over certain space activities, but also charged agencies with the dual mandate of both encouraging the private sector and protecting the public and the national interest of the United States. Today, the United States is a world leader in commercial space activities. The nation hosts an active market for launch and reentry services that delivers both cutting-edge payloads and astronauts to space. Non-governmental entities of all types and sizes have access to capacities that once were only available to governments and large corporations, sparking a renaissance in commercial space activity. The private sector is expanding into territories historically dominated by national space programs, proposing business concepts that envision commercially operated habitats in low Earth orbit, on-orbit servicing and manufacturing, and utilization of space resources. These are exciting developments, but new technologies present new issues for the government to consider when addressing space operations, and Congress must take a thoughtful approach on how to oversee these innovative activities without stifling progress. One such issue is the government's approach towards commercial human spaceflight activities. In the early 2000s, Congress authorized the Secretary of Transportation to regulate aspects of commercial human spaceflight, but not until after the expiration of a learning period that would allow industry time to grow and supply regulators with data to inform appropriate regulations. Congress has since extended this learning period twice after determining that industry was not sufficiently mature for additional regulation. The most recent extension, granted in 2015, will expire at the end of September. Congress must determine whether the current state of commercial human spaceflight merits an additional learning period extension, or whether to let the learning period come to an end. Congress also must address other pressing issues for commercial space operators, including the appropriate governance structure for both new and existing space activities, and how to advance space situational awareness to maintain safe operations in orbit. As this committee prepares to consider commercial space legislation, it's imperative that we keep U.S. international competitiveness at the top of our priorities. Ensuring a robust commercial space sector is key to maintaining U.S. leadership in space and technology. And other countries, friendly and otherwise, are actively engaging in space activities. Some seek to create a favorable environment for space companies, offering incentives for both investment and regulatory perspectives. Our legislation must be carefully written and executed to create a favorable environment here at home and prevent U.S. companies from turning into overseas destinations that promise speedy authorizations with minimal restrictions. Maintaining U.S. leadership in space is also critical to the future of the international space policy, especially as more actors become involved in space worldwide, both private and governmental. The United States' status as a major spacefaring nation has historically secured us a key role in decisions of international norms and standards. That has allowed us to ensure that our off-world activities embody our values: transparency, fairness, and collaboration. I can assure you that those aren't the norms that our adversaries would establish if they were steering the development of the international space policy. If we want to continue to set the rules of the road, Congress must work hand in hand with the executive branch and stakeholders to ensure that the U.S. maintains its status as a leader in space. Passing legislation that fosters the burgeoning commercial space industry is a key step towards this goal. As our committee develops this legislation, we'll keep these major considerations in mind: a thoughtful regulatory environment that supports innovation, a competitive approach to grow our domestic industry, and a focus on maintaining U.S. leadership in international space policy. Our witnesses today represent a range of stakeholder perspectives, and I look forward to hearing their testimony and having a robust discussion on these important topics. I now recognize the ranking member for his comment, opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on continuing U.S. leadership in commercial space at home and abroad. I also want to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished witnesses. Thank you for being here today. 3 years ago, during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, the nation breathed a sigh of relief when the SpaceX Crew Dragon demonstration mission successfully and safely transported crew to the International Space Station and back home again. The United States had been dependent on Russia to deliver our astronauts to and from the ISS for nearly a decade, following the planned retirement of NASA's Space Shuttle program. The success of that crewed demonstration mission was the culmination of years of government investment and partnership. Our nation's investment in civil space R&D, science, exploration, and utilization have advanced the underlying space capabilities and technologies that have fostered a thriving commercial space industry. I want the United States to continue to lead the world in innovative space technologies and which provide significant economic and societal benefits for our country. Today's hearing will review the governance of our United States commercial space sector, if and how the frameworks the committee has put into place are sufficient, and what is needed to not only encourage the continued growth and leadership, but to meet our international obligations. While I'm sure we all have many questions, one thing is clear. The success of the industry depends on safety. A bad day could hurt the entire commercial space industry. With that in mind, I hope we will hear from our witnesses on how we can ensure safe and responsible commercial space behaviors, which are the types of actions we want other nations to emulate. It's not only the right thing to do, it's our obligation as signatory to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 to ensure authorization and continuing supervision of U.S. non-governmental entities in outer space. In short, the U.S. government is responsible for what its commercial actors do in space. The Science Committee has been at the forefront of commercial space regulations since the Launch Act of 1984 first directed the Department of Transportation to license and regulate commercial space launches. The committee also authorized regulation of private remote sensing space systems, the last major commercial space statutory update in 2015. Since that time, commercial space activities have expanded and they have accelerated. Companies are placing mega constellations in space to enable broadband communications and other services. Private citizens are flying into space on both commercial, suborbital, and orbital spacecraft. Companies are providing in-space satellite servicing. Through NASA, commercial companies are also developing space stations for low Earth orbit and landers to deliver both scientific payloads and astronauts to the surface of the moon. Space is becoming a busy place, placing increasing importance on the role of space situational awareness capabilities to track space debris, satellites, and to warn operators of potential risks for collisions. Each of these areas come with issues and complexities, as well as advocates for differing positions. I hope we'll have an opportunity to hear from the relevant federal agencies on their role as the implementers of regulatory frameworks, as well as other key sectors, such as the insurance industry, on what Congress needs to do and what we need to consider if we're to legislate in this area. This committee will take a thoughtful look at all of the relevant information and insight as we seek to balance leadership and growth with safety and responsibility. I look forward to working with the chairman, my colleagues in the minority, and the administration on any potential legislation the committee may consider. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sorensen. Let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Ms. Karina Drees, who serves as president of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. She's also chair of the FAA's Commercial Spaceport Space Transportation Advisory Committee and serves on the National Space Council Users Advisory Committee. And prior to Commercial Spaceflight Federation, Ms. Drees was the CEO and manager of the Mojave Air and Spaceport. Our next witness is Mr. Jim Dunstan, who serves as the General Counsel of TechFreedom. He's also founder of the Mobilis Legal Group. He has 4 decades of experience as a space lawyer, which includes drafting and negotiating the first commercial lease of a manned space station. He also served as a member of the Virginia JCOTS Aerospace Advisory Committee. Our third witness is Josef Koller. He serves as the Systems Director for the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. He's also co-founder of the Aerospace Corporation's Space Safety Institute. Mr. Koller has previously served as a senior advisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and prior to that, he managed and co-led more than 40 scientists at the Space Science and Applications Group at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And our final witness is Ms. Caryn. Yes. Thank you. Let it be known, if I pronounce your name correctly, you probably should be worried. And founder and president of CS Consulting. Prior to founding CS Consulting, she served as vice president of the Regulatory and Government Affairs at the Relativity Space. She also served as the industry head of FAA's Part 440 Aerospace Rulemaking Committee and is a member of the FAA's Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, where she leads the Regulatory Working Group. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here, and I now recognize Ms. Drees for 5 minutes to present her testimony. Please.
Thank you so much. Chairman Lucas, Subcommittee Ranking Member Sorensen, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation. I'm honored to share our members' views on commercial space in the United States and the policy and regulatory issues facing our industry. CSF is the leading national trade association for the commercial space industry. CSF members expand America's leadership in space, create thousands of high-paying engineering and manufacturing jobs, and invest billions of dollars across the country, revitalizing a domestic aerospace supply chain that had been in decline. CSF members proudly work with civil, national security, and intelligence agencies to ensure they carry out their missions in a manner that is more cost-effective and innovative than government-developed solutions. The policies enacted by this committee and by Congress as a whole, including the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, are vital to facilitating the growth of the industry. The future pace of development and the retention of our nation as the flag of choice depends on a policy and regulatory environment that facilitates innovation. Our nation must leverage and grow the commercial sector to outcompete state actors like China and Russia. As the committee develops a commercial space package, CSF respectfully offers several items for your consideration. Further details on each of these priorities and a full list of priorities are included in my written testimony. First, the learning period for human spaceflight is set to expire at the end of September. As Congress considers the future of the learning period, it is important to note that industry has had slower technical development and significantly fewer commercial crewed spaceflight missions than anticipated during the last extension in 2015. CSF supports a multi-year extension to the learning period to enable key dialogues to continue between government and industry through the ASTM F-47 standards process, the Part 460 Aerospace Rulemaking Committee, and the ComStack Safety Working Group, and to ensure that the FAA has the appropriate expertise and resources to take on this authority. Allowing the learning period to end this year would lead to regulations that inadvertently freeze development before industry has had time to mature, harming safety and our nation's competitiveness in the long term. Second, consistent with prior legislation offered by this committee, the Department of Commerce is the most appropriate agency to ensure federal compliance with Outer Space Treaty Article 6 obligations for authorization and continuing supervision for activities that fall outside of existing regulatory approval structures. A light touch regime would satisfy treaty compliance requirements and provide interagency clarity while facilitating innovation and American leadership in space. A single agency must manage this process to ensure there is one accountable entity, minimal burden on industry, and no unnecessary duplication of effort between federal agencies. Third, federal space launch infrastructure demand is steadily outpacing supply. Thankfully, there is a network of FAA-licensed space launch sites across the country eager to help ensure our nation has sufficient infrastructure for this sector. However, these sites largely do not have access to federal grant money. There's an existing authorized grant program, but it has been dormant for over a decade. The program should be reauthorized with key changes consistent with GAO recommendations. Fourth, many current regulations governing commercial space activities require near-term modernization to ensure efficient processing as the rate of commercial activity accelerates. These regulations, including Part 450 launch and reentry licensing, export control regulations, and remote sensing regulations, were developed in an era with limited industry activity. Without reform, agencies risk missing statutory timelines to fulfill regulatory responsibilities, harming our ability to compete and slowing innovation while other countries surge ahead. Additionally, access to space situational awareness data is essential to ensuring continued safe operations in space for all users. As Congress considers SSA, it's important that the Department of Commerce is given the authority to take on this mission and is encouraged to use commercial services, data, and analytics to the greatest extent possible. Thank you again for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation on commercial space. It is a critical time for our industry, and we greatly appreciate Congress's attention to these important issues.
Thank you. And I now recognize Mr. Dunstan for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas, Subcommittee Ranking Member Sorensen, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I hope that this testimony, along with my recently published paper on regulating commercial space activities, will assist Congress as it considers comprehensive space legislation. The testimony I provide today is my own personal and does not reflect the positions of any organization or company. Space is heating up, not from an environmental standpoint, but in terms of business activity. Advances in space technology, especially the advent of cheaper access to space created by space entrepreneurs, with strategic funding from the government, of course, have opened entirely new opportunities for U.S. businesses to be the catalysts of the creation of a robust cislunar economy. According to the Space Foundation, the world space economy was valued at almost $470 billion in 2021, and according to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. portion of that economy generates $211 billion in gross output each year. I think that is actually understated. And space entrepreneurs are just getting started. The legal and policy questions that commercial space activities present, frankly, I thought I would be working on 40 years ago when I graduated from law school, not what we are finally addressing today in 2023. The first problem is that we do not have a comprehensive regulatory approach to commercial activities in space. We've never had a National Space Act. The rules of the road are cobbled together from various agency-enabling statutes, some with regulatory underpinnings dating back almost 150 years. The result, as I discuss in my paper, is gaps, overlaps, and stovepipes. Simply put, space is regulated by several different agencies, none of which were originally sanctioned by Congress to regulate in outer space. This includes the FCC, the FAA, the Department of Commerce, NASA, and the Department of Defense, all of which currently have a hand in directing, if not directly regulating, outer space commerce. The second problem is that following the Supreme Court's decision in West Virginia versus EPA, it is clear that agencies may no longer regulate based on vague terms like the public interest. Congress, quote, does not alter the fundamental details of a regulatory scheme in vague terms or ancillary provisions. It does not hide elephants in mouse holes. End quote. The current patchwork regulatory system is a labyrinth of mouse holes that new entrants must traverse. Great for me as a practicing space lawyer, but highly dangerous for us as a country. For there is a very real danger that courts, when asked to review regulatory actions in the future, may well conclude that Congress never provided the basic regulatory authority to those agencies in the first place. The stakes are sky high, pun fully intended. Space is inherently international, and if we do not provide a practical regulatory system that can quickly and economically authorize and supervise the activities of U.S. nationals in space, what I would call a frictionless regulatory system, two things will happen. First, and we're already seeing this, U.S. domestic companies will simply move offshore and find a country that will quickly and cheaply grant them authorizations for their outer space activities in exchange for license fees and taxes. Those fees and taxes are thus exiting the U.S. economy. Second, the existing regulatory scheme and any future regulatory scheme that is characterized with high degree of friction slows down the U.S. space economy and thus advances the interests of our adversaries, including China, who do not share our democratic principles and who would wish to export their ideals into space to our direct detriment. So what should a National Space Act look like? After West Virginia versus EPA, I think Congress needs to do four things. needs to assign clear regulatory authority to any agency or small set of agencies with minimal gaps and overlaps. It must provide explicit rulemaking authority to that agency to create the rules of the road for the space in the 21st century. It must also provide explicit enforcement powers to its chosen space agencies so that there is a cop on the beat to ensure both compliance with domestic law and the United States obligations under international law. And 4, understanding that some overlap is inevitable and that there must be some interagency coordination, ensure that that coordination process is as transparent as possible. Understand that I'm not advocating for Congress to overregulate space activities. Overregulation introduces levels of friction into the regulatory system that could accelerate flight overseas and play directly into the interests of our adversaries. Nor am I advocating for a totally hands-off approach to space activities. The dangers to the commons of outer space require us to be good stewards of the cislunar system. In the same way that the Earth sits in the Goldilocks zone of our solar system, not too close to the sun, not too far away, Congress's task is to find a balance on the continuum between permissionless innovation, where nearly anything goes, and the precautionary principle, where the government must micromanage and approve every activity by U.S. citizens in space. This is a hard but necessary task if we wish to continue to be leaders in the cislunar economy going forward. I hope that this committee will consider introducing in the formal record my paper entitled Regulating Outer Space of Gaps, Overlaps, and Stovepipes, and I welcome the questions and the dialogue on these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Koller for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Lucas and distinguished members of the committee for inviting me to join the discussion on continuing U.S. leadership in commercial space at home and abroad. I'm a systems director at the Aerospace Corporation, which is a nonprofit, federally funded research and development center working across the entire space domain to solve complex problems and advance solutions in the national interest. We provide independent and objective technical advice to all government space programs with a workforce of over 3,000 scientists and engineers. In addition to helping lead Aerospace Center for Space Policy and Strategy, I'm also the co-founder of the Space Safety Institute. Allow me to cover some aspects of a safety framework and why a holistic approach is critical to enable the projected growth in the space economy. The current approach in the commercial spaceflight sector is for industry to develop consensus standards before the government implements binding regulations. This approach appears sensible. There is a fear among commercial providers that regulation could only be a hindrance and could slow down innovation and progress. At the same time, even commercial providers are concerned that an accident would set the industry back by many years. These concerns center on defining the right balance to foster commercial innovation and safety. However, we should really broaden our discussion and create a more comprehensive picture of what contributes really to safety. In the end, no government regulation or industry standard can guarantee an accident-free environment. Only through a comprehensive set of safety-promoting initiatives can we achieve a procedurally efficient, safety-effective, and innovation-permissible environment. Based on our study on developing a comprehensive safety framework for commercial spaceflight, we identified guiding principles and 5 major groups in a successful safety framework. First, people, safety culture, and a safety management system. These 3 are the most critical aspects of any safety framework, as people are your eyes and ears on the ground and catch mistakes and possible failure modes early on before any regulators can. The next group consists of everything like best practices, industry consensus standards, regulation, certification, licensing, accident investigations, and so forth, all important in themselves. The third is about third-party reviews and safety case methods to identify safety blind spots, because everybody has them. Fourth is another important one, which is on data collection and analysis in order to catch safety issues and failure modes so that can be anticipated, predicted, and mitigated. And fifth is a component on international cooperation and open collaboration. The full report describes those in detail and is publicly available online, and it also includes a roadmap for implementation. The second part of my testimony is regarding mission authorization of commercial human spaceflight and highlighting an issue that is separate from the learning period. The FAA oversees commercial spaceflight during launch and re-entry, but operations outside the atmosphere are not part of the FAA's regulatory authority. Even when the learning period ends, the FAA authority to oversee passenger safety would only apply during launch and re-entry. Just like commercial aviation benefits from a single oversight agency, commercial human spaceflight would do the same. It should be provided a one-stop shop with a continuous chain of custody through all phases of flight. In closing, I want to highlight the need for practical solutions and their implementation in addition to a comprehensive safety framework rather than the status quo. Economic growth is not enabled by the status quo, but by a practical, innovation-permissive environment that is consistent with domestic and international obligations. The United States should lead the way in commercial human spaceflight safety. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on these essential topics, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Schenewerk for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Thank you.
Getting closer.
Chairman Lucas, Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee Ranking Member Sorensen, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to share my perspective on the U.S. commercial space industry. I think you will hear some similar themes to what you have heard from my colleagues. I am honored to appear before the committee in my personal capacity and am not representing any company or any client's views. Today's U.S. space industry's growth has been dependent on forward-looking policies and key government partnerships. This committee's support for STEM education, as well as public-private partnerships that foster technical exchanges, federal facility access, and early-stage research and development has been essential. My testimony is aimed at clarifying a few key points regarding U.S. space law and policy governing private space activities. While I haven't been to space yet, I have significant experience engaging with the regulatory regimes governing space access. Most importantly, I hope to convey that space is highly regulated and shed light on oversight of launch and reentry, including the fact that human spaceflight is not wholly excluded from regulation. I also want to highlight the need for clarifying authority over exciting new or so-called novel space activities. My first point, the U.S. space industry is highly regulated and encompasses a diverse range of activities with different levels of maturity and customers. As such, it operates in accordance with a multitude of local, state, and federal laws and that depends on where companies operate. In some cases, in fact, they may be subject to foreign laws. U.S. space companies are licensed based on their primary activities, launch, reentry, remote sensing, and telecommunications by the FAA, NOAA, and FCC, respectively. That said, each of those activities may also require licenses from one or both of the non-primary agencies. Despite this committee's support, we have not yet achieved a one-stop shop approach to licensing space activities. In addition to space-focused regulations, companies, manufacturing, and testing facilities and operations are regulated by federal, state, and local agencies governing environmental protections, labor practices, and transportation activities, among others. When companies utilize legacy U.S. government capabilities, such as launch sites or test stands on U.S. Space Force or NASA facilities, for example, they are subject to the controlling agency's rules and requirements. Second, U.S. launch and reentry companies, which compose a small segment of the space economy, approximately $7 billion of the $350, $60 billion economy, private sector economy, are subject to U.S. law no matter where they operate. That was established in the 1994 Commercial Space Launch Act. The primary focus of the CLA-based licensing regulations and review is public safety. That requires the FAA to review the design, operation, and testing of a vehicle's flight safety system, as well as vehicle hazards, including debris, toxic release, and overpressure. As outlined in my written statement, obtaining a launch or reentry license is an extensive, multi-year effort. With respect to human spaceflight, the learning period or moratorium does not limit all regulatory oversight. For example, the FAA regulates to protect crew members because they are part of a vehicle's flight safety system, which falls within the FAA's public safety authority. There are also regulations regarding spaceflight participants, including their training and acceptance of risk. Given the limited number of private human spaceflights, 3 orbital and 7 suborbital, the ongoing opportunities for thoughtful engagement between the FAA and industry, as well as the FAA's challenges with implementing its existing regulations, the original premise underpinning the learning period still appears solid. Next, I'd like to quickly focus on novel activities, an emerging aspect of the space economy. These include in-space servicing, assembly, manufacturing, or in-space destinations such as LEO habitats or Moon or Mars-based capabilities. These are exciting endeavors that do not clearly fall within FAA, FCC, or NOAA's licensing regime. Significant support exists for the Commerce Department's Office of Commercial Space having mission authority over novel space activities. I recommend that this committee support efforts to clarify agency authorities in a manner that is appropriate to the in-space activities and ensure that any regulatory regime is clearly defined. Continued uncertainty will diminish U.S. space leadership and is costly to companies developing these novel and necessary capabilities. Lastly, effective regulatory regimes require resourced, trained, and organized regulators who engage meaningfully with cutting-edge innovations. Sometimes the safest approach may not look like the status quo. U.S. space policy and legal oversight is extensive, and while not perfect, it is facilitating rapid technological and scientific advances. I have no doubt that space capabilities are having or have the potential to positively impact each of your districts, from agricultural optimization to disaster relief, energy efficiency efforts, and rural connectivity. As the committee considers commercial space legislation, it has the opportunity to continue U.S. leadership in diminishing regulatory uncertainty while facilitating continued space safety. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the time you are investing in developing balanced and thoughtful legislation. I look forward to your questions.
I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I address my first question to both Ms. Schenewerk, Schenewerk, and Mr. Dunstan. How does the regulatory framework for commercial space activities in the United States compare with frameworks in other countries? And while you're thinking about that, are there any regulatory processes impacting the ability of U.S. space companies to compete internationally? A lot of question, but two good witnesses. Whoever cares to go first.
I'll jump in first. I think we need to understand that for a lot of other countries, their approach to space regulation began with more of a clean slate, more of a blank sheet of paper. And so they have, places like Luxembourg and the United Kingdom have, I think, more specific, something approaching a National Space Act that we've never had, whereas we have sort of built it from the agency up, through the various processes. And so I think we're a little bit behind the curve because of the regulatory system that we already had in place.
I concur with Mr. Dunstan. In America, we love the phrase bootstrap, and indeed, in this case, I would say that we have bootstrapped our legal regimes from existing regimes. And so, that is a significant difference, and I do think that it is a disadvantage in some cases. It does show American ingenuity and are willing to be innovative with regard to how we apply our regulations and our desire to ensure that our companies are able to proceed with their activities. But it definitely begs that as we look at the new in-space activities, the ones that I mentioned and other ones that are, even things like space nuclear power and propulsion, are we thinking about these new activities in a manner and devising legal regimes to govern them that are forward-looking? I like to say that we shouldn't let a failure of imagination be the source of our failure, and so we should be imaginative as we think about what the possibilities are for the future. And I do think that there is a point where we may realize that building on the existing foundation, we've built too many layers of the house and the foundation is not strong enough to hold it. And so I do think that we need to be really thoughtful as we think, especially in competition with countries like China that have very different legal regimes, if you want to call it that, governing their activities. So I guess the short answer is, we need to definitely be thoughtful about the way we're doing things today, and we certainly need to be very careful and thoughtful about how we devise new regulatory regimes for tomorrow's activities.
Absolutely. To Ms. Drees, in just over 2 months, the statutory learning period that limits FAA's ability to regulate human spaceflight safety is set to expire. What's the status of standards development efforts related to commercial human spaceflight?
Thank you so much for that question. The industry has been working very hard to ensure that we continue that standards process. We continue working directly with our regulator to ensure that we're developing these standards and eventually regulation very thoughtfully, very carefully. I agree with my colleagues that safety is the highest priority by far within industry. So far within the ASTM process, 7 standards have been passed. 2 are up for ballot right now, and there are 10 currently being drafted. There's been substantial progress made even in the past 12 months. Everyone within the industry has now come to the table, and we also have FAA AST participating.
How would the added workload of regulating human spaceflight safety impact FAA's execution of its existing responsibilities to license launch and reentry? Of course, to protect the uninvolved public.
That's an excellent question, and one of the top concerns that we have with respect to the 460, which is the human spaceflight regulation. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done on the Part 450 regulation, which is the launch and reentry licensing piece that the FAA is responsible for. They released their new rule in 2020, and there's really a long way to go to ensure that that rule, that regulation, is working well for industry. So the concern that we have is if we put too much on AST's plate all at once, it will really detract from their primary mission, which is the safety of the uninvolved public through launch and reentry regulation.
Mr. Dunstan, as noted in testimony, FCC is licensing authority for satellite spectrum. However, FCC has begun to propose regulation for satellite activities beyond the transmission of spectrum. Is this consistent with FCC's authority, in your opinion?
I do not believe so. I think that exceeds the FCC's authorized authority to regulate.
Going one step further, is the FCC the appropriate agency to lead federal efforts on satellite regulation beyond spectrum, or are there other agencies that have a stronger interest and bring better expertise to the table?
I think there are other agencies that are better situated to do that. The FCC is incredibly good at licensing spectrum and allocating spectrum. A lot of the other stuff, they simply do not have the expertise in-house.
If my colleagues will indulge me for one more moment, what are the potential consequences of FCC's increased involvement in space activities?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's going to be speed. The FCC has had a great difficulty even keeping up with the licensing of spectrum, and to put more on their plate in areas that they just are going to have to come up to speed on, I think is going to slow those activities down substantially.
Thank you. My time's expired. I recognize Mr. Sorensen for 5 minutes.
I'd like to begin by thanking Chairman Lucas for convening this hearing and our witnesses for appearing before us today. I'm a meteorologist and also the proud son of an aerospace engineer who is a contractor supporting the Space Shuttle program. I have a visceral memory of the loss of Challenger and her crew. After the Challenger disaster, I didn't see my dad for several days. My dad worked for Sunstrand in Rockford, Illinois, a city that I now represent. Sunstrand was a contractor on the Challenger project, and after the disaster, my dad and his colleagues spent days determining if the O-rings that they produced for a mission were on that shuttle, and they were not. With that indelible imprint from my childhood, I'm very interested in knowing what can be done to continually improve safety for those explorers and those heroes. As the committee that leads our government's R&D efforts, we have an obligation to ensure space flight safety. Ms. Drees, can you speak to what agencies, such as the FAA's Office for Commercial Space Transportation, are doing on R&D to support commercial human space flight safety? And are there other areas of R&D that would enable continued safety advances in commercial human spaceflight?
Thank you so much for that question, Congressman Sorensen. I completely agree with you that safety is by far the most important aspect of the entire industry, and every single one of our members, as far as I know, believes that as well, which is why we're working so hard to ensure that we maintain the perfect safety record that we have with commercial human spaceflight. You mentioned the shuttle program, and yes, our members and myself obviously agree with those tragedies were very difficult for every single American, and especially myself and folks in my generation growing up in that era. It wasn't so much the Apollo program for us, it was the shuttle program that was so impactful for my generation. The challenge that we have on a regular basis with respect to safety is we want to be able to innovate our vehicles to ensure those things don't happen, which is exactly what we're doing. So the challenge is if we start developing that regulatory environment too soon, before we have enough data, before we have enough knowledge of those individual vehicles, there is a long-term safety risk that something could go wrong. The purpose of continuing to innovate while we develop these standards side by side with the regulator will allow us to have the most safe vehicles on the market in the future.
I appreciate that. Instead of learning from our mistakes, we need to make sure that we're using science to not make the mistakes in the first place. To Dr. Koller, we recently lived through the harrowing incident of the OceanGate Titan submersible and the rescue campaign that was undertaken. As we see the rapid evolution of commercial space activities, what do we know about contingencies for on-orbit human safety and in-space rescue, which will be even more challenging than was done for Titan? And who would be responsible for that?
That is a very important question. Thank you for asking that. Often people make comparisons and also call it apples and oranges. What's similar is that similar clientele, similar price range, informed consent. But when it comes to in-space rescue, comparing it to the OceanGate tragedy, what's really important to understand is do we have the capabilities, the authorities, and the environment in place to actually rescue somebody from space? For the OceanGate tragedy, the Coast Guard immediately, and not just from the United States, from other nations, rushed to rescue and spend enormous amount of effort trying to find the submersible. We do not have anything in place for in-space rescue. We have no strategy in place. We have no capabilities. And I think we need to start now to learn from examples like the submersible and submarine rescue and from the past and what capabilities need to be put into place, but also answer the question on who pays for what efforts, and because is it a humanitarian effort to rescue somebody in space? And so all these questions still need to be answered.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Dees, why is it important that the U.S. lead this standards process, developing standards?
Thank you so much for that question. Just as we want to set the norms of behavior in space, we want to be able to have a good standards regime within the United States that the entire international community follows. And the challenge that we're having right now is if we're too focused on some of these other things or too distracted by some of these other things, then the challenge is international players could start to develop their own standards as they dominate more of the space activities.
Okay. I heard some references to giving FAA more authority to regulate space. And I just want to share with you, before I got elected to Congress, starfighters who operate a fleet of F-104s flown by pilots that have flown zillions of missions and zillions of miles safely, had been doing parabolic testing for NASA for years. You know, it's so much cheaper to put your experiment in the back seat of an F-104 and do some parabolic stuff than it is to launch a rocket to do the same thing. And as it would be, some people said, hey, I'd really like to take a ride in one of those things and, witness weightlessness for myself. The space tourism business is already booming. We'd already worried about people with, hundreds of reservations at $250,000 a shot to be weightless and taking them up in the cargo planes. And so starfighters applied for a launch license to carry these tourists. That was 14 years ago. Now, before they even applied, FAA had licensed human space launches in Nevada for a company that had, never launched a bottle rocket. And they said, well, we regulate airlines from Washington, D.C. to Orlando, things like that. And we did this real extreme over here, space regulation. But you're kind of in the middle. So for over 14 years, they've been fighting to get a license that any other country in the world would gleefully grant them. You know, I'm real concerned about that. And Ms. Dees, can the U.S. government support the commercial space industry with its allies in global standards bodies?
Yes, absolutely. And our members are working very hard on standards development across the board, not only with human spaceflight, but there are a lot of standards organizations that we're helping to be involved with to ensure that we're setting the stage for these norms of behavior.
Okay. Mr. Dunstan, what do you think about the prospect of FAA basically taking over all space activities?
I don't know that the FAA has that expertise in-house. It certainly has the expertise as to launch and reentry. They've got great engineers over there. But when you're talking about what activities somebody can conduct in space, I'm not too sure FAA is the proper home to be authorizing that or regulating that activity.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes, Ms. Loughlin from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that I think we need to wrap our heads around is who bears the risk of commercial activities in space, who's accountable for things that go wrong. And along those lines, I'm concerned about the potential for on-orbit collisions from space debris, defunct satellites, or even active satellites, especially with mega constellations being deployed that comprise large numbers of satellites. The United Nations is taking a look at this issue along with others, and I'm not sure who in the U.S. is accountable for the potential damage for these risks. Now, the Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce is currently working to establish a civil space situational awareness capability to track debris and issue warnings to space operators on potential collisions. And the DoD, of course, is performing this function, but I think it's eager to transition it. So to what extent is there a clear plan in place for the civil capability? What will it entail? How do we deal with the potential and avert the collision risk? And I don't know who should answer this, but maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Koller.
Thank you very much. That's a very important question. Space debris is a real issue, and conjunction avoidance maneuvers are done to a large degree, especially with large constellations. To the first part of your question, who bears responsibility? Well, I want to defer to my legal colleagues here on this distinguished panel, but it's the Outer Space Treaty, Article 6, continuous authorization and supervision that's bared by the nations. So the plan is, I think Let me answer the question from an international perspective. What I see is that the United States has been struggling with who should hold what types of responsibilities and authorities in this arena. And I see the international community standing by to some degree. But I think that time is about to pass now, and I think the status quo is not adequate. I see we're trying to figure out what organization should hold what responsibilities, and I think it's time to make an assignment and stick with that assignment.
Thank you, Ranking Member Lofgren. So a couple of things to contribute to this. One is that my colleague is correct. The Outer Space Treaty addresses this, but it's actually addressed in the Liability Convention. And the Liability Convention is focused, as are most activities and discussions around space, with the idea of protecting the uninvolved public and accepting risk in space. So the Liability Convention assigns strict liability for activities that occur in the airspace, so in Earth's airspace or on the ground. So to the extent that a piece of debris falls from space and lands on my car, the launching state is responsible for that. And I've actually been involved personally in managing debris that is re-entered and had to be cleaned up or addressed. And so what happens is it's a government-to-government engagement because it's a treaty obligation. And we have insurance in the launch industry and reentry insurance, in the launch and reentry regulations that governs that responsibility, that indemnifies the government or covers the government up to a certain amount. And we've never, ever had any claims in any way that hit any kind of cap on the insurance that coverage that's required. But it's strict liability. In space, it's actually, you have to find fault. So it's more similar to, what we would consider regular tort liability. And so that's the framework, and it's the idea that if you're in space, you're accepting the risk of being in space. The second aspect that I want to highlight on this are the efforts that are happening at the UN, for example, with the long-term sustainability space activities. So that's working to set norms of behavior in a collaborative environment at the UN, as well as significant nonprofit efforts and industry-led efforts. So even the World Economic Forum is talking about, say, space sustainability at this point. ComStack has talked about the issue. I know ComSpock is thinking about the issue. There are numerous activities. It is the hot topic of the day because everybody recognizes that the last thing we want to do is junk up space, because then we can't use space for all these very important capabilities that can save lives on Earth.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. First off, thank you very much, every one of you, for being here. Ms. Drees, the last Commercial Space Act called for the FAA to deliver a report on human spaceflight safety frameworks. This report was to be delivered after coordination with the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, ComStack, but the FAA posted a draft report that was not coordinated with ComStack. What is the status of that report, and why did the FAA issue a draft report without ComStack's input?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, and by the way, it's my honor to serve as the current chair for the ComStack, so I'm deeply involved in these topics. So the FAA has drafted a report to Congress. They've asked ComStack for input on the report. ComStack held a meeting in May to discuss the report and come up with recommendations for the FAA. ComStack has agreed on the recommendations. We're still working through some of the additional language. So ComStack will be sending that report, the comments back to FAA probably within the next week, and then the FAA will be able to wrap up that report. The challenge from my perspective is where we didn't see a lot of data from the first draft of that report was specifically answering the question about which aspects of the industry should call for new regulation and why. So when ComStack weighed in, we wanted to make sure that that concern was addressed.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Schenewerk, I know how to pronounce your name. The approval process for commercial remote sensing systems involves an opaque interagency process that has led to licensing delays and often overly burdensome conditions placed on the operators. This inefficiency had significant impacts on U.S. leadership. When several U.S. companies sought to establish synthetic aperture radar services here in the 1990s, we've alluded to this already a little bit, delays and dysfunction in the approval process pushed those capabilities overseas. Many proposed models for space governance feature the same opaque interagency structure that operates outside of the Administrative Procedures Act. How can we ensure all space activities don't fall victim to the same troubles that the commercial remote sensing industry did?
Thank you, sir. I think it's because of the Texan connection.
That's it.
So I very much appreciate your question, and I think that the point is exactly that. At the end of the day, somebody has to be responsible. So one of the fundamental, issues that we face in the remote sensing world has been whether or not a specific office and a specific designated official has responsibility for approving or disapproving and even giving feedback, specific actionable feedback, in a clear time frame to the applicant. And we're facing that challenge across all these regulatory regimes that govern our space activity, but you're correct that in the remote sensing realm, it specifically was a problem that did send activity overseas. And so, we're seeing a resurgence resurgence and a significant resurgence in Earth observation capabilities growing in the United States right now for a number of reasons. And the last thing we want to do is see a chilling effect on that as a result of that problem, the black box problem, as it's been referred to. So I would say that as we develop a regime to govern any kind of novel activities, the in-space activities, that's often talked about as an interagency process, right? We need to have a clear door that I take my clients to, a clear person who is responsible at the end of the day for adjudicating the differences among the agencies and making a decision that they can be held accountable for in allowing or disallowing or placing conditions upon the applicant's activities.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Schenewerk. Mr. Dunstan, does the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, pertain to activities in space?
Thank you for that question. I believe it does not. TechFreedom has filed 2 amicus briefs on appeals from the FCC in which we walk through the history of NEPA. In fact, it was passed in 1969. Something else really important in space happened in 1969. We were walking on the moon. It was also just after the Senate had ratified the Outer Space Treaty of '67. Congress knows how to specify when it wants something to apply to outer space, and Congress did not say that NEPA applies to outer space.
Absolutely. Thank you. One more. Ms. Drees, the FAA recently announced plans to reduce the amount of airspace closed off around launches at the Cape. What are the FAA and industry doing to better integrate and coordinate launch activity with air traffic? And are there recommendations from advisory groups that the FAA has not implemented?
Thank you so much for that question. I'll be very brief. So there are opportunities now for industry to work directly with FAA, and we're doing that through a collaborative decision-making effort where a lot of the space companies, including Commercial Spaceflight Federation, are talking directly with FAA ATO on a lot of airspace issues. ATO has been working on developing this space data integrator tool. There are other tools that they're considering, and this was part of the recommendation from the Spark in 2018, I believe, or the Aerospace ARC at the time, where we recommended some additional tools. So the FAA is evaluating those options at this point, but we are working very closely with them. We are also working closely with the airline community. Now, that's something that's different through the CDM process to ensure that we're exchanging information in much more real time, and having those open dialogues with the aviation community.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you to the chair and ranking member, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and for your expertise. I'm grateful that we're having this hearing because the rate of human spaceflight and commercial activity has risen steeply since 2015, when Congress last considered updates to commercial space policy. In fact, according to the FAA, in 2022, last year, a record 79 licensed launches made commercial space activity 9 times more frequent than it was in 2015. Commercial rockets are servicing the International Space Station. Regular satellite launches and the advent of commercial space tourism have raised concerns about improving human and environmental safety, and I think that's especially highlighted now in light of the recent analogous OceanGate situation. It's also critical to strengthen the transparency about occupant risk and also build cooperation, collaboration among companies and regulators as we assess this maturing industry and put safety at the center of its rapid innovation. So I want to ask first, Ms. Schenewerk, this past April, as you know, SpaceX attempted the first launch of the orbital test flight with its Starship rocket, which exploded and destroyed much of the launch pad. So the result sent concrete chunks of the pad, clouds of pulverized debris miles away, and that affected a small South Texas towns and a national wildlife refuge. And it's my understanding that both SpaceX and the U.S. government are facing lawsuits, and the environmental effects are still being assessed. So is it clear who's responsible for understanding, assessing, and where appropriate, mitigating against environmental risks and other consequences of commercial space launches?
Yes, ma'am, it is. Thank you for your question, Ms. Bonamici. It is actually clear. So the thing that is true about the space activity that you just referenced is that it is subject to environmental law no differently than any other activity, whether it's an industrial activity, a building activity, whatever it may be, the NEPA applies in the same manner. So in my testimony, my written testimony, I included a chart that showed all the different parts of the review of a license or reentry activity, and a significant aspect of that is actually the environmental review. It can take many years before you can even start building your launch site or your reentry site. Reentry sites tend to be a less construction to date, but that environmental review, so, and it depends on, and you follow the same evaluation on whether or not it's an an EA or an impact statement. So the answer is yes, it does apply, and the activities that will follow the law in the same manner that they would regardless of the leading agency.
Terrific, that's helpful. My next question is for Ms. Drees. The commercial spaceflight industry operates under an informed consent system currently for human spaceflight. So in the April 2023 report, the RAND Corporation stated that it was unable to examine the extent to which spaceflight participants are being fully informed of the risks because informed consent documents are considered proprietary. So, Ms. Drees, how can the commercial spaceflight industry improve transparency, and how can Congress and the FAA evaluate the safety of the industry if the moratorium on commercial regulation is extended another 8 years, especially when consent documents are considered proprietary?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, so the industry currently operates under an informed consent regime. So the FAA currently regulates the launch and reentry aspects of the actual launch. They regulate some aspects of the vehicle, but the participants that are inside the vehicle participating in that activity are asked to sign a waiver, essentially saying that they've been told what the risks are of that vehicle. They've been told that that vehicle has not been certified by the FAA. The FAA has very specific requirements in what the operator must inform of all of those activities to that participant. So the participant is very well informed because of what the FAA requires. So there is a pretty extensive process in place to ensure that the folks that are signing those informed consent waivers know exactly what they're signing.
I appreciate that. And Dr. Koller, your study's focus on what can be done to improve safety was based on an extensive analysis of other commercial sectors. And you note that the study's recommendations do not affect space vehicle design or affect innovation. So with that in mind, is there any reason the government should not require or regulate actions to improve safety, or should it be voluntary?
I think it's really important to broaden the conversation, and in addition to talk about the difference between industry best practices and regulation, is that we broaden our perspective on what contributes to safety. There is an inextricable tie between safety culture and the prevention of accidents. For example, another example is we need to understand where failure modes are coming from. So collecting data, analyzing it is very important. Otherwise, you're just working in a retroactive regime, and we need to be proactive and predictive.
I agree with that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to recognize a gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Baird.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Appreciate the opportunity to listen to such expertise from our great witnesses. So we thank you for being here. You know, a few months back, I had an experience visiting the Zucro labs at Purdue University. And this one-of-a-kind facility developed a hypersonic pulse shock tunnel, which allow for flight simulations for speeds ranging from Mach 5 to Mach 40. Their most recent development being a Mach 8 quiet wind tunnel, and this one wind tunnel provides the critical development in hypersonics and is the first of its kind to collect data in speeds greater than Mach 6. The advancement in the hypersonic industry is reimagining the way we look at suborbital commercial flight. So my first question, Ms. Drees, goes to you. You mentioned in your testimony that Congress should enact a learning period extension past September of this year and mentioned 2031. If the learning period was to expire, can you explain the impact that this would have on our advancements in hypersonics and global competitiveness? And do you agree with CFS to extend the learning period to 2031 or would you suggest something else?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, CSF absolutely agrees that the learning period should be extended for a number of reasons. First and foremost, with a focus on safety, we feel like the only way to achieve that in the long term is by focusing on industry consensus standards today, rather than writing regulation today based on the vehicles that are designed today. We want to enable an industry that allows entrepreneurs to flourish, that allows new companies to come online with new capabilities, and it's very difficult to do that if the regulation is already in place. There's a lot that we have to sacrifice potentially and give up if we start regulating now, versus allowing companies to continue innovating on their own designs, iterating on their own designs. The challenge that we have is the folks that are designing these vehicles are the experts. They truly are the experts. There's no one else that they can lean on to get advice from on how they should develop their own systems. So we want to be able to continue focusing on those standards alongside FAA until we get to that point where we're much more comfortable together as an industry to focus on regulations.
So would any of the other witnesses care to comment on that question?
I'll just add, sir, that one of the important points about where the industry is that it's a very diverse industry right now. So we have 3 activities that are occurring, or 3 entities that are licensed to operate and fly, including humans. Those 3 entities and their vehicles look vastly different. So I think it's an important point that writing a regulation based on a number as small as 3 is a challenge in and of itself, much less in an industry where you haven't had a consolidation of design. So what we often see in much more regulated industries, such as the cruise industry, even the commercial aviation industry, trucking industry, is that those things all look like each other. So, you can have innovation around the software or around the edges of those, but what you don't see is real innovation in the design of the vehicle and of itself. And I'll point to the fact that our industry has really innovated in ways that are driven at safety. For example, the vehicle that is flying to space right now and looked at the previous vehicles and learned the lessons based on the data and the science around what the best shape of a vehicle is for the highest safety factors. And that, of course, was in partnership, and this is a very important point, with NASA and, thereby with the government. And so I think there's also a point to be made around this, that these activities aren't happening in a vacuum, pun intended. They're happening in partnership often with government officials, and they're based on a significant amount of experience in the past. I also will add that one of the ways that we could benefit is we do have expertise that aren't in government today or aren't in the companies, but the availability of those folks and the way that they engage is often somewhat challenging. So I think that we need to have a situation where we can have, free access, for example, perhaps to engineers at FFRDCs, or free ability to exchange information. That said, the proprietary aspect of these vehicles is still an important aspect of being commercial and being competitive. And I think that what we'll continue to see is safe operations, because we also see aligned incentives across government, industry, and the regulators.
Thank you for that, and I see my time has expired, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all our panelists. It's a big topic that deserves a lot of attention and, frankly, coordination across multiple committees in the Congress, which is how the U.S. is going to continue to lead in the commercial space industry. And we talk a lot on this committee about investment and the need to invest, and we go through that in our reauthorization process, and we're also in appropriations. But as I was thinking about today's hearing, and as I heard Mr. Dunstan deliver his opening testimony, I just have to ask, where and how is the international law working? And what happens if it gets broken? And we start to see a lot of innovation coming into play. We recognize and remember Mr. Musk doing Starlink for when Russia invaded Ukraine. But what happens if that takes place in the reverse? And how do we start enforcing, and this is in one of your recommendations, sir, how do we start enforcing international law if we're working with actors who might seek to break it?
Well, when I was discussing enforcing, I was specifically talking about U.S. agencies regulating U.S. companies. Obviously, when we're talking about international treaty obligations and norms, now you've got to go to the State Department, which is our arm there, which is more difficult. And we do have the Space Force. Our United States Navy, protects our interests on the high seas. And hopefully the Space Force will protect our interests and our citizens in outer space.
And as we're looking to compete with the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm on the select committee for that topic, we're looking at a range of business practices, some that are fair, some that are not. And are you aware of any instances in which some nations that might be more adversarial to the U.S. are not necessarily obliging treaty negotiations or are potentially giving a signal that state-owned enterprises are going to get in the way of our free market enterprises as it pertains to commercial space activity?
So thank you for that question. I think it's twofold. One is I think the real problem that we're seeing right now is we're seeing especially Chinese companies coming in and trying to buy their way into U.S. technology. I have a number of clients who frankly have turned down some pretty big sums of money because when you trace it back through the 8 or 9 layers of companies, it turns out the money is coming from China. And we know that what's going to happen there is going to be an outflow of intellectual property. So there is.
So they're willfully making that choice to turn down the investment.
Yes, yes, they are. The second thing I think is the United States needs to be more aggressive in terms of its stance on ASATs. And we need to take a position and push the international community to stop testing things that create tens of thousands of pieces of debris. It's just stupid, and frankly, it doesn't really need to be done. We know how that works. We know how bombs work,
right.
And so we should really press our international.
And debris has come up a couple of times already, and I had a question on debris as well, because how are we managing that? And even the simple question of how does a satellite get into space and what rules do you have to go through? And we've obviously got our own system, and then there's other countries that have their own system per se. But then we're dealing with this junk, and it is going to cause us some challenges. And so I don't know if any of our other witnesses want to jump in on the risks of debris in addition to what we've already talked about.
Yeah, if I may add to that. There are several ways of dealing with debris. One, of course, is called the Space Traffic Coordination System that lets you coordinate amongst the different operators to avoid the debris generation through conjunction and collisions. There are other effects like in drag debris. If it's in low Earth orbit, will re-enter automatically. So if your placement is not high enough, it's in the lower Earth orbit, it will automatically re-enter. And third is active debris removal. And I think there is some more work to be done.
Yeah, and who pays for that, right? And how do, are we picking up the world's debris in outer space? And, who are good actors, who are not, in different systems and the like? I mean, those are good questions, and we'll submit the rest for the record. But thank you all so much. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, and I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
Let's see. Miss Schenewerk, you mentioned that the possibility of companies experiencing overregulation or other things that could drive them away from the United States and to another place. What do you think that we as a Congress should do? I guess there's some regulatory things that already is sort of people understand and we're talking about, but what could we do to prevent that or maybe enhance that or something?
Thank you, Congressman Webster. So I think the most important piece is looking both at what we're doing today and looking at what we're planning for the future. So the activities, the in-space servicing activities, assembly, manufacturing, mobility activities, space habitats, the activities that are not subject to the launch and reentry regulations, where we definitively say that you are subject to U.S. law and jurisdiction no matter where you go, those in-space activities, particularly the ones that I think will define the future of our industry, as we think about who owns the oversight of that, and as I mentioned in my testimony, there's a lot of thought around the Department of Commerce's Office of Space Commerce handling that. That ownership at Office of Space Commerce is more similar to the way other countries have structured theirs, where they're thinking about those activities in regards to their economic contribution and the potential for economic growth, and also their terrestrial impacts. And so I would say that what we want to do is make sure that we develop an oversight regime that is clearly defined, transparent, and has clear time frames for feedback to applicants. So I know which door to go into, I know how long it's going to take, I know exactly what I need to provide, and I will say that what I need to provide should be clearly tied to the key aspects of the activity. What are the most important things that the government cares about? Is it a national security concern? And then who is responsible at the national security apparatus to give the feedback back to the person who is the authority at the Department of Commerce, and thereby adjudicate the decision and give me my license?
So just as much as the determination of what should be done, there's also the idea of what agency, what department, what form of federal government, or one that doesn't even exist, should take up those, and it could be multiple ones. Is that correct?
Well, currently it is multiple, and I don't honestly see a day where it won't be multiple. So an in-space activity, for example, a company that wants to provide space servicing, who wants to refuel on orbit or wants to clean up debris on orbit, they're going to use spectrum. So they're going to have to talk to the FCC no matter what, because they're going to need to communicate with their satellite. If they're undertaking remote sensing activities, which they probably are, because they're probably doing rendezvous proximity operations in order to combine with another satellite and provide that refueling or to pick up that debris, that currently is an activity that is mostly overseen by the Department of Commerce's NOAA and its remote sensing regulations. So, that there's some expertise there with that activity. So I think we'll find ourselves in one office, but we'll find ourselves, as we do today, talking to multiple offices unless we have a wholesale reform of our regulatory approach to space.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Ms. Drees, how does AI affect all of these things we're talking about?
That's a really interesting topic, and one that our members are paying very close attention to. There are definitely a lot of benefits and a lot of risk with artificial intelligence, especially with something as sensitive as space. We have a lot of smart people working on these issues right now, and there are some companies that are already starting to use AI for their technical development. So it's definitely something the industry is watching very closely.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ross, North Carolina.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Lofgren, for holding this hearing, and thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. My state of North Carolina, actually our state of North Carolina, has a long-standing federal-state partnership with NASA that brings an impressive capacity to NASA and the nation through leveraging research, education, outreach, and products that have relevance and transferability at the state, regional, and national levels. In 1991, North Carolina Space Grant was established, which is administered at NC State University in my district. North Carolina is inspiring the NASA and commercial space workforce of the future. In fact, one of our own NC State graduates, Christina Koch, is one of the 4 astronauts selected for Artemis II, the first crewed mission on NASA's path to establishing a long-term presence at the moon for science and exploration. My first question is for Ms. Schenewerk. You have extensive experience in the commercial launch industry. To what extent is workforce and the availability of a skilled workforce an issue? And does this issue affect the commercial space sector, and are there issues for Congress to address?
Congresswoman Ross, I'm so grateful for this question because there are issues, and it's an important topic actually with regard to regulation, because one of the things that we heard at the Comstock meeting just this week in our discussion about the oversight of launch and reentry and the implementation of Part 450 is the challenge that the regulators are finding in recruiting and retaining talent. So they need engineering talent and analytical talent that can go toe-to-toe with the industry in order to be able to engage with us meaningfully in our innovative designs and operations. And so one of the things that we really need to be thinking about, and I think this is a charge for the committee, is what does it look like to be able to support that agency and the other agencies that oversee space in making sure that they are staffed in a manner that fulfills their obligations to your interests and in furthering research and development, in furthering safe regulations, and in making sure that we're competitive. So thank you for that question.
Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in?
Yeah, real quick, what I would like to say is about 5 years ago, I asked a similar question at a panel, and at that time it was not relevant, or it deemed not relevant. Today, I really appreciate the question and highlighting that issue. Just to summarize very shortly, I do not think you can grow a $1 trillion space economy without the adequate workforce. So crucial investments are desperately necessary.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. We are very proud in our membership. When we think about STEM, when we think about the educating the workforce, our members are highly in tune with this and highly interested in this. And in a lot of ways, the new space industry is STEM. This is where we're getting a lot of folks interested in these science and engineering jobs. A lot of our members have their own organizations that help to inspire and really get even kids as young as kindergarten excited about what's going on in the space industry. So we do see this as a real challenge, but I think a lot of the new space companies are proactively engaging not only with the educational systems, but also with the administration, with the Space Council and their STEM initiatives, because we recognize that as the industry grows, developing talent is going to be absolutely critical.
And just to re-ask my last part of the question, what can Congress do? Because what I've noticed is with everything going on with the Webb telescope, I also have the Museum of Natural Sciences in my district, which projects all of these things in this enormous globe called the Daily Planet, where you can watch what's going on in space. That Congress has made some recent investments in space exploration, so kids want to be rocket scientists again instead of go to Wall Street. And is that something that's on us to do as well as you?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I appreciate the question. I think the answer is that Congress needs to make clear that space is open for business and that there are opportunities there. In addition to my space law practice, I have done an awful lot of internet law. And I will tell you, we lost an entire generation of who probably would have been aerospace engineers, became internet engineers, because that was the exciting place to be. And so we need to do everything we can to re-entice the next generation coming up. At a very early age, STEM's got to start, as Mr. Rees said, in kindergarten, and we've got to make sure that everybody understands that there's a place in space, as a child growing up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And by the way, the gentlelady from North Carolina, I believe Christina Koch lives in my district, just so you know.
Educate.
All right. Okay. All right.
And mine.
A little friendly competition there. The chair now recognizes Ms. Strong.
Thank you, Chairman Weber. My district is an epicenter for space activity in the U.S. with NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and many space industry partners located in the greater Huntsville area. I look forward to working with my colleagues on developing a modern commercial space bill that supports the growing number of space companies in my district while also supporting our civil and national security space capabilities. Ms. Drees, you mentioned that commercial spaceflight Federation members are already using crisp lunar space to generate value for our economy. At the same time, Marshall's Space Launch System and Moon to Mars system will require greater investment and collaboration with industry to create a strong deep space exploration business model. Can you elaborate on how members of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation are working with NASA to stimulate the commercial crisp lunar economy that supports deep space exploration?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. So with the Artemis program, when NASA announced that we're going back to the moon, it inspired a lot of existing companies and new companies to start thinking about how are we going to develop this cislunar economy? How are we going to develop the moon and, in the future, Mars? And how are we going to use the moon to go to Mars? And there's an entire ecosystem that needs to be built and developed to make that happen. So the first step really is NASA saying we're going back to the moon. Once NASA says we're going back to the moon, then they can determine how many launches per year, what are we going to actually do there from a NASA perspective, and the industry can really grow around that. So there's a lot of exciting opportunities. Folks obviously that are building a lot of great things in and around the Huntsville area. A lot of our members are there as well, and all over the country really that are developing these capabilities. So it really is an exciting sort of next step when we think about what happens in space beyond LEO that a lot of companies are getting more involved with.
That's great, and I know that we've got to have NASA say it, but I think Congress has already said it. We're going back to the moon. Ms. Drees, how can we work with commercial partners to develop interoperable deep space systems without compromising national security and intellectual properties?
So that's an excellent question. And what I would say is, you know, we've gotten to the point now where commercial space is the entire government really is dependent on the capabilities of commercial space companies. So not only are the companies that are working on space systems for commercial use or for civil use, they're working on a lot of these systems for national security purposes. And because of that, they work closely with national security organizations, with the intelligence community, to ensure a lot of these coordination things are already happening.
And I know that I've got everything going at you, but I appreciate your answers. What government agency is best situated to create international deep space interoperability standards? Who do you think would be best to do that?
So that is a really good question, and it's something that the community is really starting to think much more about. There are a lot of standards opportunities happening right now in terms of what could happen in the future, what could happen in a cislunar environment. It's still very much to be determined. I think we have a long way to go before we start thinking about that. I think the first step really is in something like the Artemis Accords, which has been established and a lot of countries have signed on to, really is sort of the first step in that process to ensure that we're getting countries on board to start to develop these norms.
Thank you. National security agencies are using commercial remote sensing data to enhance and augment their capabilities. We have seen firsthand how impactful the use of the commercial data is and how quickly the DoD and armed services can get critical intelligence from commercial partners. Mr. Dunstan, can you elaborate on how the government agencies can use the model that our national security agencies have used to better leverage the commercial space industry, especially the growing remote sensing sector?
Thank you for the questions. Yeah, I think that you can really look at what national security agencies have done vis-a-vis remote sensing, and it can be applied elsewhere rather than continuing to build all of their own facility by diversifying and using data from commercial sectors. It's really enhanced our national security, which is really interesting because if you go back in the original Landsat Act and whatnot, there was a real concern that commercial entities shouldn't be allowed to do this. And now I think we've realized that it's a real asset. It's not a national security liability to lean hard on commercial remote sensing data.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Liu.
Happy to recognize. I think there are members before me if they want to be recognized, but I'm fine.
You want to see if anybody will volunteer?
Okay, I will go. So thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. It's very helpful. I represent the 36th Congressional District in Southern California. We have a lot of space assets, so I'm honored that the Aerospace Corporation is located in the district. It is the same district where the James Webb Telescope was assembled, and I just talked to a CEO of a company last year who's manufacturing pharmaceuticals in space. And so space is really important to my constituents as well as to America. And I want to talk first about critical infrastructure sectors. So the United States has designated a number of critical infrastructure sectors, and according to the Department of Homeland Security, here's a definition. There are 16 critical infrastructure sectors whose assets, systems, and networks, whether physical or virtual, are considered so vital to the United States that their incapacitation or destruction would have a debilitating effect on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination thereof. Some of these sectors include the chemical sector, the food and agriculture sector, assets such as dams, but space is not one of them. And so I want to ask Ms. Drees, do you think it'd be important for space to be one of them? And I do have legislation with Congressman Ken Calvert, we're co-chairs of Aerospace Corporation, or Aerospace Caucus on this legislation, and so one to get your views on that.
Thank you so much for that question. It is a really important question, and it's something that is actually being considered right now. There's an effort under DHS right now to sort of take a look at the critical infrastructure system, whether space should be included in that conversation. There's absolutely no doubt that this country relies on space and the space industry to perform just about every task these days. But the question really is, what does it mean to be considered critical infrastructure? And that's the process that DHS insists are going through right now to make that determination. There are a number of companies that are engaged in that conversation. And as we sort of continue really working with these industry partners and with the government partners to determine, is this really going to be the best path for the space industry overall? Because there are a lot of capabilities that are still very new, I think there's just a lot of questions to be answered. But there's absolutely no doubt that this country relies on the space industry.
Thank you. So let me know if we can be helpful. So second, I have a question about safety. And I understand that when you put a human being on any launch vehicle, you're going to make sure to go above and beyond in terms of safety. I'm just curious about before that happens, about all the research and development. And so Bill Nelson was here at this committee, and I'm going to read a portion from Space News that talked about his testimony. It was after the SpaceX launch that had to be aborted mid-flight. Testifying before the House Science Committee about the agency's fiscal year 2024 budget request, Nelson said SpaceX expects to be ready to make another Starship launch attempt in as low as 2 months. The explosion, that's not a big downer, he said. And then he goes on to say, the article says, he explained SpaceX's hardware-rich approach to vehicle development with several Starship and Super Heavy vehicles in production. That's their modus operandi. They launch, and if something goes wrong, they figure out what it is, go back, and they launch it again. So as you know, SpaceX did this monumental thing where they designed rockets that fly back and land, and they're reusable. If they had to sit there and make sure the very first time they launched that, it worked, maybe they wouldn't have developed that for several more years, if at all. So, Dr. Koller, I'm just curious, what is your view of that approach, that when you don't have a human being on this, maybe we let companies innovate and try different approaches? Just wondering if that's a sensible way of doing it.
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer in agile development. The paradigm of failing often and failing early is very much adequate, and that is the reason why we see so much innovation today in this sector. However, I would reserve that for the non-crewed, non-human, non-passenger phase of the development. I do believe failing often and failing early does not apply anymore once people are actually on board.
Thank you. I see my time is up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and thank you all to the witnesses who are here today. In my district, NASA Glenn Research Center works closely with the commercial industry on a variety of programs, including the Artemis mission to return to the moon and to go beyond. These partnerships bring together the government's institutional knowledge and world-class facilities with the speed and efficiency of the private sector. And I know this has been touched on already and a little, hopefully not too repetitive or redundant, but Ms. Drees, Ms. Schenewerk, or Mr. Dunstan, can you further highlight the benefit of partnerships like these and lay out how we can ensure their continued success at NASA, Glenn, and elsewhere in the future?
I'll just start briefly. You guys can definitely chime in. So it's incredibly important, and there are a lot of opportunities to really partner between commercial and civil organizations. In particular, the Glenn Research Center is really important to our space program, and a lot of our CSF members partner with Glenn in a variety of ways, even through communication service programs and Space Nuclear Network. There are a lot of other opportunities to partner with NASA through things like Space Act agreements, and with all of the NASA facilities around the nation, a lot of companies are taking advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the Glenn Center especially has been very good with working with the commercial. Unfortunately, at times I don't think that filters all the way up to headquarters, back to Washington, D.C. I was extremely critical of the Moon to Mars architecture that NASA put out because it placed commercial partnerships sort of way down in the corner of their overlapping Venn diagrams. In fact, it got me a trip to Johnson to talk more about that. So I think we need to keep our eye on that and the fact that there is so much innovation going on in the private sector. We can't go back to the moon with a new Apollo. We've got to rely on our commercial partners and bring that technology back to NASA.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I believe that if we could get NASA further down the road, at least NASA Glenn Research Science Center, the program authority, I think that we could expand on those relationships a lot, and I'm never going to stop pushing for that, being the representative in Northeast Ohio with that center right there. So to everyone's dismay, I'm going to keep on pushing for program authority. As some of you may know, NASA Glenn also administers the Communication Services Program, is pioneering NASA's near-Earth space communications. This program, in part, will procure commercial services for space communications. By NASA's own admission, using commercial technology will provide NASA missions with a cost-saving access to continual industry innovation, saving money that can be refocused on scientific work. Again, this is for any of the witnesses. Can you please elaborate once again on NASA's collaboration with private sector companies on the Communication Services Program?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that. I absolutely agree that coordination is vital. I do spend a lot of time at the FCC, and I will tell you that oftentimes NASA is extremely cooperative and good to work with, but there are times when you'll have an application sitting before the FCC that there will be a very short letter from NASA, which essentially says, stand by, we're looking at this, and then it takes a long time for them to come back in and get there, and meanwhile, the clock is ticking on the time value of money for commercial entities. And so even Glenn, as good as they are, has got to speed things up in that coordination efforts. We can't allow NASA to just, this is sort of the precautionary principle. We can't say, hold off until we decide that it's safe. That coordination has got to move with greater speed and relevancy.
If I could add to that, in agreement, but in addition, I would say that this is an example of one of the challenges of government using commercial more, right? So using commercial style contracts, which tend to put the burden on the commercial entity to go through the commercial licensing regime, which is not wrong, but it does result in a situation where the government is looking for a capability, and then another part of the government is slowing down their access to that capability. And so, it is something that is in need of kind of whole of government thought about. So we've sent demand signal from the national security world or from the civil space world to commercial to develop this capability. We potentially have a procurement or we have research and development funding flowing to that capability, but then we don't have either a clear regulatory regime or we have a highly disorganized regulatory regime that entity will have to go through before it can provide that service back to the government customer. So you have to kind of think about all the threads that get pulled, and I don't say that in any way to diminish the benefits, which are huge, of using commercial style contracts. I say that to highlight that you have to think holistically about this as we think about why regulatory reform and why smart regulations are so important.
Yeah. I'm not going to disagree with either of your assessments, and couldn't agree more that regulatory reform needs to be put in place and dialed down just a bit to be a little bit more pragmatic with where we are within this country. As we continue to put guidelines and revisions on ourselves, foreign countries, and our adversaries, and even allies are moving forward at the speed of light, and we are still stuck back in time, unfortunately. I thank all the witnesses for your answers and for your time today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and Congressman Fushi. If you were supposed to have been recognized earlier, then that was Congresswoman Loughran's mistake. But of choosing the gentleman from California in lieu of you,
I will say it's
was
the
me,
staff's mistakes.
Then I'm responsible. So at any rate, you're recognized.
Not an issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly Ranking Member Loughran for having this committee hearing today. And thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony and appearing before us. First off, I'm going to join the competition and make sure that for the record, it is known that astronaut Christina Koch went to high school in my district.
Man, NASA when you throw the gauntlet down, it's tough.
Absolutely, absolutely. NASA has said that the billions of dollars in savings it has generated from public-private partnerships across its portfolio will enable it to return to the moon while also allowing for vital investments in climate science, STEM, and more. This question is for Ms. Drees and Dr. Koller. Can you outline how these partnerships with the commercial industry support NASA, and what steps are needed to maintain both rapid innovation and fiscal responsibility?
Thank you so much for that question. It has been absolutely essential for NASA to partner with industry on a lot of programs that we've seen and a lot of programs going forward. And there was a shift not too long ago of bringing commercial partners on board through firm fixed price contracts, through more partnership agreements to enable the industry to provide the best possible options for the federal government to take advantage of. So what we've seen change with NASA over the past really 15 years, we see that continuing to develop, and there are a lot more opportunities to get to have these partnerships. In addition to the Artemis program, which is going to be absolutely critical to the future of the space program, the ISS is going to be retiring in the next several years, but NASA has proactively started working with industry to develop commercial habitats to essentially replace the ISS in the future to allow NASA astronauts to continue going to space. So this partnership has been absolutely critical.
I don't have really anything in addition to add to that fantastic answer. I think public-private partnerships in the United States are of great value and should be continued. There's a tremendous benefit in using those kind of tools and developing synergies with the industry. It's also important not to just look at the benefits, but also the risks involved.
Thank you for those responses. NASA and DoD's partnerships with commercial space companies promote economic growth far outside the industry. In North Carolina, new commercial satellite services are providing high-speed connectivity to communities in my district and across the state that had been left behind in the digital divide. Ms. Drees, can you please elaborate on how this industry supports other national priorities beyond space exploration, like broadband expansion, workforce development, climate science, agriculture, and more?
Absolutely. That's a really great question and very important thing that we're seeing not only within the space industry, but what we're seeing is a lot of the technical development because of the space industry that's helping a lot of other industries as well. For example, you mentioned climate science. We wouldn't know, I think the estimate is 50% of what we know about the climate is because of assets in space, commercial assets in space through remote sensing. We wouldn't have the knowledge that we have. We wouldn't be able to be proactive about some of the things that we want to be able to do to help the climate. Agriculture as well has now relied much more heavily on the remote sensing industry. So there are a lot of opportunities to bring some of that technical capability that we're developing in the space industry to more to solve more problems and challenges here on Earth.
Dr. Koller, would you care to elaborate as well?
I think there's a very interesting trend happening when it comes to remote sensing and communication and artificial intelligence and analytics. There's a very interesting trend that leads to more transparency in the world. And just like Ms. Drees pointed out, there's a tremendous benefit in using those trends and finding the right combinations to derive those benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Man, where do I start? Ms. Schenewerk, you said in your remarks, and I'm trying to quote you now, don't let innovation or the source of our imagination be the source of our failure, or something to that effect. Can you elaborate on that?
Don't let our lack of imagination be the source of our failure.
Okay.
Yes. So, you know, one of the things that we see, again, going back to my experience with launch and reentry, was that the original launch regulations, because originally it was just launch, were taken directly from range requirements. So one of the things that they didn't imagine was a day when we would have reusable rockets like SpaceX has with Falcon 9. So I was at SpaceX at the time when we were licensing Falcon 9 and working with the agency to figure out what you do in a situation where your regulations say one thing and they don't contemplate this potential state where you have a reusable orbital rocket. And so what I mean by that more broadly is we need to make sure that as we devise a regulatory regime, that we're not just thinking about the specific thing that is in front of us today, at that time, only expendable rockets, but we're thinking about developing a regulatory approach that is flexible as well as clearly defined. And that is not easy. There's no kind of...
Thinking outside the box.
Right, exactly. And I'll note that there has been a shift to performance-based regulations, right, which can accommodate more optionality, diverse kinds of approaches to technology, but they're not a panacea. And I'll refer back to my comment about the need for well-staffed, well-trained, well-organized regulators, because when an applicant comes in with a unique approach and the regulator is used to things being done the way they've always been done, that failure imagination could occur in the sense of saying, this could be safer, but we're used to the status quo, so now it's harder to get the safer approach through or nearly impossible.
So my recommendation would be in their engineering department, above the door, it ought to say Imagineers instead of engineers, so they think outside.
I fully support that.
So, and this would be a question for everybody. And one of the questions was, in 2018, Trump administration issued Space Policy Directive 2, which proposed the elevation of Commerce Department's Office of Space Commerce to report directly to the Secretary of Commerce. Then we also mentioned DHS, because you know we're going to have some bad actors in space. Which agency, in your opinion, Ms. Drees, and we'll go this way, do you think should be in charge?
So I think in the immediate term, there need to be several involved, as Ms. Schenewerk mentioned earlier. When it comes to things like mission authorization or the gaps that we have to fill, CSF is definitely supporting the Office of Space Commerce to fill that role. So the commercial activities that fall under the Article 6 Outer Space Treaty obligations, we think the Department of Commerce is going to be the best agency to handle that.
Mr. Dunstan.
Yeah, I would agree for those gaps, that Department of Commerce, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that not every single activity needs to be regulated. If someone is up in space and pulls out a harmonica, they shouldn't need a license to be able to play their harmonica on...
That depends on how good they are.
Well, yeah, there is that. But yeah, we have to be careful that we're not over-regulating every single activity, because that's just going to clog the system up.
Mr. Koller.
I want to draw on the what Ms. Schenewerk said earlier in a similar way of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I see that we've had this discussion for way too long now, and I think it almost doesn't matter anymore which agency is responsible for what types of activities, as long as you provided with the adequate resources, the workforce, and the capabilities to actually fulfill that requirement.
So a trifecta, DHS, Space Force, Commerce, Ms. Schenewerk, who do you think?
So my expectation would be that those entities would all, to the extent that it was appropriate, and I think that the person who is responsible, so if it's housed at the Department of Commerce, then the official that runs that office and runs that application process would be responsible for establishing the interagency review on any given application. And if that application and the activities in that application should be under consideration by DHS, then it would be their job to bring DHS in. It would also be their job to say, DHS, we've heard your concerns, and we're going to move forward. And that decision-making process needs to be clearly placed in one location, and then have a time frame associated with it.
I was going to say they have a timeline because
Yes, sir.
we don't want these things to drag on.
Yes, sir.
And I'm going to go to you, Mr. Dunstan. The 1967 Cooperation Act, I forget what it was called, was literally what, between Russia and the United States primarily at that time. Russia wanted it to be state-driven, and the United States wanted to be, industry-driven. How many more co-signers do we have now onto that? Do you know?
On the 67 Outer Space Treaty, I believe it's 112 nations. So the vast majority and virtually all countries that have any presence in outer space are signatories to the outer space treaties. But that begins to then drop off as we go through the treaty regime, less so for the registration convention.
Well, I'm running out of time. I apologize for going over, but I would offer this idea that we need somebody who is watching all the actors in this and has a responsibility to say bad actor, you know what I mean, and one that we have to really be focused on. I'm going to yield back and recognize Mr. Lee. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Lee, here we are. I'm looking over here, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel today for your time, your expertise. In recent years, Pittsburgh has stamped itself as a hub for development and innovation in the commercial space industry and space aviation. Just last month, I had the honor of announcing and voicing my support for the Keystone Space and Defense Innovation District that will bring together partners in the tri-state area of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Astrobotics, one of our companies based in Pittsburgh, is a leading company in the commercial space industry, specializing in lunar lander development, lunar payload delivery, and other space-related services. They recently won a $79.5 million grant from NASA Commercial Lunar Payload Services program to deliver payloads to the lunar surface. I'm proud that companies and universities I represent play a pivotal role in developing cutting-edge technologies for the commercial space industry and space aviation. Our vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem supports startups and small businesses. Their expertise spans a wide range of areas, including robotics, artificial intelligence, material sciences, and advanced manufacturing. These innovations have been instrumental in enhancing the capabilities of space systems, satellite technologies, launch vehicles, and more. And just to shout out a few of our higher education partners, we have Carnegie Mellon University, which is renowned for its expertise in robotics and AI. We have the University of Pittsburgh, who collaborates with NASA on various research projects and initiatives, advanced materials for spacecraft, biomedical studies, and the effects of space travel on human health. And we have Duquesne University, which offers a space law program to analyze the legal and policy aspects of space activities. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to brag a bit. Our amazing higher education partners do incredible work. But there is enough space in the sky for all to contribute to discoveries in space, regardless of whether they hold an advanced degree or went to a four-year university. So while Pittsburgh has a rich history in robotics research and development, I look forward to seeing that opportunities in educating and training the next generation of space industry professionals are more equitable and accessible to all. Commercial space aviation is undeniably fascinating and holds immense potential for scientific discoveries, technological advancements, and economic growth. However, I want to make sure that the development and activities in the commercial space industry remain relevant to the day-to-day concerns of citizens. While space exploration often captures the imagination, I want to be able to translate its achievements into the practical applications that impact the lives of people I represent. I also want to remain mindful that my environmental advocacy must reach to the lowest depth and the highest heights. The development and deployment of space technology should strive to minimize carbon emissions, waste generation, and pollution. Sustainable practices must be implemented to reduce the industry's ecological footprint and align with the day-to-day concerns of citizens regarding climate change and environmental stewardship. So with that in mind, Ms. Drees, I'm just wondering how someone like me, a representative, could reconcile the growing amounts of money from both the public and private sector on space exploration with my constituents here on the surface of Earth, right? We have people who have so many concerns about how they're going to meet their ends day to day, and they're facing cuts to social welfare and programs like Social Security and SNAP benefits. So what type of work do you do that translates to those folks on their day to day?
Thank you so much for that. I completely agree. You know, there's so many exciting things that are going on across the country in terms of technical development, entrepreneurship. When I got interested in the industry almost 20 years ago, there was very little going on. And unless you were an engineer, you had no chance of working in the industry. And the new space industry has evolved, the commercial space industry, I should specify, has evolved in such a way that it needs everybody. It needs engineers, but it needs technicians, it needs welders, it needs plumbers, it needs everybody that can contribute to the industry, because there's so much happening within the space industry. And it's not just rockets that we're launching anymore. There are companies that are building satellites, there are companies that are building habitats. There's a lot of things happening even on the ground. There's a ground infrastructure, but there's so much that the entire space industry needs. And as Caryn mentioned earlier in her remarks, even the regulators are struggling to hire people.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a significant demand for labor in the industry across all levels.
Thank you. Just really quickly, how are these scientific discoveries being accelerated by commercial space aviation? And also, what do these discoveries mean for creating solutions in community for like urban agriculture and combating pollution and mitigating adverse effects of climate change?
I'm happy to take this. I'm actually working on a TED Talk about this. So I think that it's a very important question. There is a massive amount of data that we can collect from space, and we are on the verge of collecting even more. So we have capabilities for Earth observation, like hyperspectral, that offer great opportunities for us. So one of the most important things that we need to do is we need to be able to get massive amount of data, and then we need to be able to analyze that data and apply it across a number of industries, whether that's agriculture, whether that's being able to design more energy efficient. So can we see our buildings from space and then make good decisions about how we manage our energy use? Space offers the ability to have that data. It's then what do we do with the data? Mm-hmm. So that's also a job creating opportunity. It's also why things like quantum computing and AI are so important, because those are tools that we can deploy against the data to then help us make good decisions, to then drive outcomes that impact everyday Americans, particularly those that are suffering the most.
Thank you. That was my time. Thank you so much for answering those. I look forward to your TED Talk, and I yield back my time.
Man, she speaks about 250 words a minute with Gus up to about 350.
It's my gift.
Yes, ma'am, it is. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for a fascinating hearing. Dr. Koller, I was particularly interested in your testimony regarding the creation of a safety framework for space. I think that that's extremely important. You said something in your testimony that really resonated with me. You said that an effective framework would guarantee an accident-free environment. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because I'm not sure I agree, but I think it's very important that we consider what we mean when we put together a safety framework. I think it's important that we crystallize our approach to safety and what the end goal is. And I think that this thinking can be informed by our experience in the commercial aviation sector, where we started out with a terrible accident record where accidents occurred all the time, and now we've got to the point where all the people on this dais go hurtling through the stratosphere at nearly the speed of sound twice a week, usually, with the expectation that we will always get to where we're going and that accidents will never occur. So I think spaceflight will be on a similar trajectory. But I also think that, something else you said that resonated with me was that a single accident might set the industry back many years. And I think that's absolutely true. We've had a similar kind of public opinion problem with autonomously driven cars, where we hear about one accident caused by an autonomous vehicle in the entire country, and it makes front page news, and yet we've got tens of thousands of auto accidents that are caused by human drivers that occur every single day that aren't making the news. So really we're not using a fair metric when we think about safety in that respect, where the metric should be is an autonomously driven car safer than a human-driven car? And the metric instead that we're applying is that one accident anywhere is too many, and is an illustration of a problem that has to be solved. So, thinking about that, what should our approach to safety be in commercial spaceflight?
Right, I hope I didn't create a misunderstanding. What I was trying to convey is that there is no guarantee that a industry best practice or a government regulation can prevent an accident from happening, right? But what we instead need to do to develop a more comprehensive, more holistic safety framework. If you look at all the different sectors, regardless if it's transportation or medical, there's always a more holistic, almost an ecosystem around safety developed. And it's never just industry best practice or regulation. That's what I was trying to say. And only if you take into account key components in our report that I have here. In our report, we lay out the fundamentals of those key components. And if you really boil it down to what is at the center, regardless of what launch mechanism you have. Do you have horizontal, vertical, or even balloon rights? People and safety culture are common. The common denominators, and people are the ones that make mistakes. So safety culture is the key, in addition to collecting the data and to be more predictive and proactive. And there's a number of additional components that build a safety framework, and I think there's many lessons that can be learned from other fields.
Right, I agree with you. And I'm hopeful that we can build a safety framework that recognizes our responsibility to protect consumer safety, but balances that against our responsibility to allow innovation and to allow freedom. And I think in aviation, we've done a pretty good job of that, where we recognize that our obligation to someone who buys a ticket on an airliner is different than someone who buys a ticket on a two-seat ultralight, right? Those levels of safety are not equivalent. We have a responsibility to do some education with the public that their expectation of safety in those two situations is not equivalent. And yet there's room in our aviation ecosystem for both of those uses, and I hope that we can accomplish something similar in spaceflight, because I think we're going to have to confront that question eventually. Well, I don't think I have time for another question, but I want to thank you very much. Hopefully this discussion that we can continue. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back, and next we go to Ms. McClellan from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for planning this important hearing. And I always enjoy when we talk about space and everyone goes through what's in their state, reminding everyone that manned spaceflight began in Virginia at Langley. And that we are still home to the NASA Langley Research Center, the Wallops Flight Facility, and several commercial space companies that provide critical services, develop innovative technologies, and promote economic development in our Commonwealth and beyond. So since we're putting those markers down, I just wanted to remind everybody of the importance of NASA Langley. With that, Dr. Koller, could you discuss any gaps that need to be addressed in the regulatory frameworks for commercial remote sensing, including any challenges with the updated three-tiered approach to assessing risk?
A few years was intricately involved in the interagency negotiations on what are the right license conditions, and I was very pleased in the progress that have been made over the last 5 years. In the past, it was a lengthy, difficult process, and I boil it down to due to the fact that different heads of departments and agencies have different authorities. And we recognized that a few years ago and developed a memorandum of understanding that really advances the resolution process of when there are differences in opinions as the Secretary is providing national security conditions that, and the Department of State is providing conditions on international obligations. So I think there is a tremendous progress has been made, and I was very pleased to see the progress in the tiered approach between the three different tiers, and I see the numbers of approvals, the timeline for approvals have gone down tremendously, and there was great progress. Since then, I sort of lack the insight on where things are being stuck or if there are still issues, but in general, all of these were a great advancement and improvement.
Thank you for that. Ms. Drees, would you speak to how the U.S. government is working with the commercial space industry to enable more activity at commercial spaceports, especially those like Wallops?
Thank you so much for that. That's actually one of our priorities is space launch infrastructure and making sure that we retain that robust launch infrastructure across the country so that facilities like Virginia Space Center and Wallops have that ability to continue launching commercial payloads at any given time. There's a lot of activity that happens in the federal ranges, at the federal ranges at the Cape in Florida and Vandenberg in California, but there's an entire network of commercial spaceports across the country that can continue ensuring that we are able to develop these assets into space. And one of our priorities is ensuring that the STEM grant program, which is the grant program available for commercial spaceports, get reauthorized and refunded, so that we can continue developing those or allowing those assets to go into space from other facilities. Wallops is definitely one of the national assets that we consider in our commercial spaceport network, and Rocket Lab has been recently launching out of Wallops from a company that was originally established in New Zealand. So I think it's a testament to say, there's a lot of capability, there's a lot more capacity within the spaceport community, but an infrastructure program for those spaceports is essential.
And then I wanted to follow up with you on a previous question. From the industry perspective, can you discuss what changes to the regulatory environment would be needed to provide certainty for long-term investment and job growth?
So from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of room for improvement overall, from launch and reentry regulation, export control, to remote sensing regulation. There's so much that we really need to be looking at as an entire space program within the industry, within the government, to make sure that we can continue that robust launch cadence. We've seen a significant uptick overall in the launch cadence over the past couple of years. I think 180 orbital launches even last year, and almost half of those are coming from China. So there's a significant factor that we're considering here with international competition. The regulatory environment in the U.S. is absolutely critical to making sure that we can retain that competitive edge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The lady yields back, and now we go to the great state of Georgia with Representative McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I first wanted to address in the last couple of days the most commonly asked question, which is, first of all, no, I'm not abused at home. So now that we put that to bed, I wanted to go on with some other things that continue a line of questioning from Mr. Weber that he addressed to you earlier. He talked about you talked about the treaties. We talked about the EU and their regulatory burden on what's happening right now. And knowing that they're kind of leading the way in regulation right now, what do we do to fight that tendency to constrict what we're supposed to get done when we have an ally, a group of allies really, that are doing something that may inhibit the progress of something we need to do, especially when we have to work in coercion with them? How do we combat that mentality, both here in the United States and also globally, so that we don't put ourselves at a disadvantage to those people who are maybe not playing as nice? And I'll leave that for either Ms. Drees or Ms. Schenewerk.
Perfectly said. So I'll happily answer the question, and thank you for it. So I think that the comment that Mr. Dunstan said earlier with regard to the fact that some of the other nations that have passed space laws started with a blank sheet is certainly beneficial to them. And I'll reiterate that American innovation is beneficial to us. So, they're still, despite the challenges that we have, if you're going to operate in a democratic, regulated country, then I still posit that this is the best one to operate in. That said, we want to stay competitive, to your point. And so I think that, the work that is being done by this committee in collaboration with the National Space Council, with the Senate, and with industry, so that working together aspect is very important. And I think that what we need to make sure that we do is, to Ms. Drees' point, continue to look at the regulations that we have and continue to look to optimize them, improve them. We can't be afraid of saying, oops, we got it wrong, or it was right then, but for today it needs to evolve. And so that is a burden that is on us constantly to run while we chew gum, I guess. and so we need to be actively engaged in looking for the opportunities to improve, supporting with resources to both do the job and do the improvements at the same time.
So I'll make the comment that I just hope that we don't go down that same trajectory of over-regulating our industry in the idea that we of course have to be safe, which we've kind of addressed tonight too, but that we don't hamstring ourselves in the competitive world that we live in. Secondly, we've seen this massive explosion of the both low and high orbit vehicles that are out there right now, and you can see even the debris and everything else like that. And one of the things we have a real concern with a trajectory that basically I think by 2030, we're supposed to have around 58,000 satellites out there, which is going to be phenomenal in tracking them. And I know the FAA is trying to get involved in that, and we already mentioned all the other organizations that want to participate in that. But, Ms. Drees, I'll probably address you on this. Will it be necessary for the U.S. to have an entity capable of managing space traffic around the Earth's orbit, a single agency?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And we believe the Department of Commerce is that agency. So when it comes to space situational awareness, there are a lot of even commercial capabilities out there. And if the Department of Commerce will leverage the existing commercial capabilities, they can help fast track some of these programs that they have in mind for managing the space assets. So the critical thing about what's happening in space is not so much the functioning things that are in space. It's the things that we can't really control, the debris that we can't really control, the things that may not be able to maneuver. Someone actually mentioned a great analogy that's really stuck with me. You know, the things that are in orbit, that are going on in orbit, are sort of like a marching band marching across a football field. The marching band is in perfect order, and they're in sync, and they're very well choreographed. The debris sort of acts as the fan who's running across the field that is causing a lot of chaos within that marching band. So that's kind of what we think of when we look at things like debris. So the satellite community is, very responsible in terms of making sure that their assets are deployed in the correct orbit, that if they need to decommission those satellites, they have a process by doing that.
Real quick, because I'm almost out of time and I want to give you ample opportunity to address this, but why the Department of Commerce is superior over other organizations in managing what you're describing right now, what you're laying out?
So they've already been designated as the Agency for Space Situational Awareness. There are always questions that continue to come up about whether that should be the right agency, and even when those questions come up, it tends to derail a lot of progress that's already been made. They are the most capable of managing that, and they already are managing a lot of the space situational awareness that the Department of Defense has handed over to them.
Okay, good. And with that, I yield. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back, and now we go to Mr. Caston from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Baird from Indiana. So thank you all for coming here today. We're talking about civilian and commercial uses of space, and I guess I sort of parse that into sort of looking down and looking up, if you will. And if I start with looking down, I want to build on Mr. McCormick's questions. My understanding, and maybe I'm misinformed, is that most of the monitoring we do of how crowded space is getting is ground-based, either from DoD or commercial uses. And I guess I'd welcome, I'd ask Dr. Koller, but welcome anybody who's got thoughts on this. Are there scenarios where we need to think about space-based monitoring, maybe at higher elevations, at higher orbit levels as well? And that may rapidly get beyond things that we can have in an open hearing, I realize, because there's civilian competition that then shades into confrontation if we're not careful. But I guess I would just love your thoughts on, should we be doing more space-based monitoring? Are we doing enough? What should we be thinking about in this committee with respect to that?
Absolutely, and there are actually, in fact, a number of companies who are pursuing those kind of activities. They also need to be provided with the appropriate remote sensing licenses, so absolutely, yes.
If I can chime in, I think one of the things when we're talking about space situational awareness is how much data we are collecting, and we're improving on that, and we have improved very, very significantly. But that problem means you have more data in the all against all conjunction analysis. And those models need to get better because, frankly, satellite operators are having to move around way more than they should have to, simply because our models as to how close or whether or not there's actually going to be a collision are not good enough. And I analogize it to what the FAA did a number of years ago by upgrading its systems to allow planes to fly 3 miles apart as opposed to 5 miles apart. And that's the thing we're going to need in space, because all that data doesn't do us any good if we're constantly, telling operators 7 or 8 times a day that they're going to have to move their satellites around.
Interesting. Thanks. I didn't know if you were chiming in there before I get to my question.
I just want to agree with Mr. Dunstan and note that that's why we talk about space situational awareness and the need to have high fidelity space situational awareness before we can move on to some kind of space traffic coordination. Because if you don't know where things are with a high amount of, with a good fidelity, high confidence, then it makes telling people to move and where to go pretty risky. And so you're introducing risk into the system versus what you have today. So we really need to perfect that space situational awareness capability, to your point about the ability to do that from space and from the ground. So that's infrastructure investments that need to occur, as well as analytic capabilities. I think that's the other thing I'll note is, and why in that case would that be something at the Department of Commerce, given that it's this traffic management potentially? And it's because at that point we're talking about space actors who are engaging in space activities in a known environment who have gone to space to do space commerce. We're not talking about innocent people who are climbing on board with an expectation of safety as a passenger on a plane. And so it's a different kind of coordination on a technical to technical operator level versus a flying public situation.
I want to get another question. I think there's a rich conversation just because I think DoD gets in there very quickly in ways that we need to be careful about. My second question, I almost hesitate to ask, but I'm going to do my best and hopefully not set our nation backwards. The second part of commercial is sort of looking outward, right? And the space tourism and travel and maybe ultimately settlement or colonization of other planets and the moon. And there's such a tremendous inspiration in all that, and I don't want to in any way lose the inspirational value of that. I also sit here and say our species is unable to inhabit the vast majority of the Earth. The parts of the Earth that we are unable to inhabit seem to be getting bigger lately. Sea levels rise, the ocean gets bigger, the deserts get bigger. We've got more and more parts of the low latitudes that exceed temperatures that humans can live at. And that's to take nothing away from tourism, but I just find myself wondering, do we need to level set? Is it practical? Is there any practical scenario where our species that can't figure out how to live on most of the Earth has a viable path to live on any location we have ever identified?
I'll take that one on. The simple answer, and it's not simple, is eventually we need to move our heavy industry off of the surface of the Earth and into space. And if you look at some of the great visionaries, Gerard K. O'Neill and other people like that, that's what they've been advocating for. And there's multiple generations of people that have grown up firmly believing that if we can take the bad stuff that we do here on the Earth and move it out into space where it can be better contained, we'll be much better off as a species. Also, it increases the resources, incredibly, to be able to tap into space power and the resources of space, so we can actually increase the size of the pie and fight less about the stuff on the Earth.
Thank you so much for your time. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and next we go to Georgia with Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and just want to make it obvious. I think my other colleague from Georgia, y'all can tell who the troublemaker is. Now, Ms. Schenewerk, I want to kind of go over a couple of things that are usually my favorite topics. And one of them has really been discussed here a lot, and that's regulations and China. I had the opportunity to be in Taiwan last week, and they were boxing up their latest satellite for launch. And I thought it was really cool that, a country of 24 million people are actively involved in the space race. And That being said, and you take a look at China and where they want to be dominant in everything from the economy to space and military, and they say they want to surpass everybody by 2045. So you take that into account, and then you look at the amount of spending that they're doing on space. They may even pass us before 2045. So I guess my question is, the cost of ceding that leadership in space to China is pretty big. How can the commercial sector be utilized to help maintain the U.S. leadership?
So the U.S. private space industry services all three of the U.S. space markets, so to speak, and the international markets: commercial, civil, and national security. So to the extent that NASA makes research and development investments with one company that has, say, developing capabilities for nuclear power and propulsion or for hyperspectral imaging, those capabilities can also benefit, of course, the national security side of the house. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that we segment these markets and we segment oversight of them, but at the end of the day, we really want to make sure that we have this robust capabilities. So it calls upon us to think holistically about our efforts and our investments. So are we making decisions that foster venture capital? Because that certainly has been a big piece of the growth of the U.S. Commercial space industry. Are we passing smart regulations so that when we're engaging commercially and the commercial companies having to get a license, they're able to do that and that's not overly burdensome? Are we thinking smartly about our procurement approaches? Are we setting requirements and sending demand signals that companies can then get investment and they can build against in order to develop the capabilities that we need to be competitive? So there are a number of pieces that need to be put together to get the puzzle right in the United States based on our system in order to compete competitively with China.
Goodness. Thank you. Swapping over to the regulation part, in your testimony, and I'm sorry if this has already been asked. I know sometimes I feel like a ping pong ball being bounced back and forth between these committees hearings, but the FAA has only issued 4 licenses under the Part 450, and you noted that 2 of those licenses had exceeded the 180-day time limit for review. Do you feel that with the time FAA, if they're going to become more efficient in issuing Part 450 licenses, and alternatively, if there are aspects of Part 450 that can be reformed, do you think they can be reformed to make it more streamlined?
So I'll start with the last part of your question, which is I'm encouraged by the fact that the FAA tasked ComStack, the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, it's FACA, on which I serve and lead the regulatory working group, with an effort to advise them on updates to the 450 regulations that are needed and how to prioritize those vis-a-vis other regulatory changes that need to happen at the FAA. We approved recommendations on Tuesday to the FAA, and those recommendations do call upon the FAA to address specific aspects of Part 450 that are proving problematic. It also notes that because we've only had 4 licensees under Part 450, some amount of experience with Part 450 makes it, or limited amount of experience makes it challenging to give those kinds of specific, discrete feedback aspects. But a big piece of the feedback was on process. And so we're encouraged, of course, that the FAA is seeing more resources, the ability to hire more people. And I really think that it's very important in a performance-based regulation scenario that they be well-staffed and well-trained in order to be able to go, as I've said, toe-to-toe with industry. So I am concerned by the amount of time that it's taken to get those licenses, and I think that the folks at the FAA are working very hard. They're very intelligent, very dedicated public servants, and they're trying to implement regulations that need to be updated because they were moved very quickly through the system, and industry is very eager to work meaningfully with them to get it right.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and we go next to Representative Tonko from New York.
Thank you, sir, and I thank our chair and ranking member for holding this important hearing, and I thank our witnesses for their participation. We know that private companies rely on good and sound science to inform their most important decisions, and so much of that science emanates out of the robust federally funded research enterprise. The public-private partnerships that have allowed the space industry to flourish over the last 60 years will continue to be the cornerstone of safe and successful commercial space activities. So the federal government is undoubtedly in the best position to create standards that will protect the integrity of the R&D required to advance these ventures. Unfortunately, we're not only dealing with a patchwork of agency and regulatory processes for the licensing and approvals to operate in space, but we also have a patchwork of scientific integrity policies across the plethora of federal agencies. Throughout my time in Congress, I've made the establishment of federal scientific integrity policy standards a major priority. It is imperative that no matter what administration is in the White House and no matter who is at the helm of our federal agencies, scientific research can be relied upon as a safe launch to deepen our exciting opportunities in this age of commercial space activity. So for anyone on the panel, or any and all, what is the importance of scientific integrity in the context of commercial space activities, and how does that play a role in R&D efforts driven by the private sector?
I think scientific integrity is the fundamentals, is part of the fundamentals of scientific development. And in a collaborative approach between academia and industry and the government, I think we need to find ways to accelerate scientific progress and development, because those are the seed points for technological innovation and development.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'll add to that from maybe a little bit of a different perspective. You know, one of the things that we see as an opportunity in the space industry is being able to bring scientists to the ideal environment where they can conduct research, ideally in a suborbital or orbital environment. And what we're seeing is, you know, a lot of companies that are partnering with government and with academia to be able to bring that scientific community up to space. In addition to a lot of the companies and organizations that are members of CSF, we also have several universities and other organizations that we consider research affiliates, and we work closely with them as well. We have a space applications research group that we work very closely with. So there is a lot of opportunity for scientific development, even within the commercial space sector as it is.
Anyone else? Yes, Ms. Schenewerk, please.
Yeah, so the add I will make to this is the opportunities that have been created. So Ms. Drees was, referenced this to some degree, but also with affordable launch and with more affordable manufacturing of space craft, we see that aspect being those affordability aspects affecting the ability to get science to space faster too. So one of the things that kind of as a crossover with this committee's jurisdiction is thinking about how organizations like NASA think about how they conduct science and how they may need, in some cases, to modernize their approach to engaging the scientific community with the space community because of the opportunities that now exist that previously didn't. So the fundamental approach of bringing science to space is definitively different today than it has been in the past, and we need to make sure that that's moving through the system, getting into the academic world, and we're making sure that we're really building those public-private partnerships to make sure that we're capitalizing on that affordability factor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And looking forward to the future, what possibilities are each of you most excited about in the commercial space sector?
So I mentioned I haven't gone to space yet. I would love to live in a world where a person like me, who's been a government servant and now a lawyer working with a number of companies, could go to space. I think that the benefit for that is that my time or my investment would then garner further activities, because the thing that I'm really excited about with space are all the aspects of space that can benefit people's lives here on Earth. The technology that we will develop that will help us clean water so that we can have sustainable water in space, that helps us with more sustainable energy approaches, that helps us understand how we could do better crop growth, how we can have rural connectivity so people can access information to help them make a decision about how they might vote or about how they might access benefits or how they might travel next week. Whatever it is, space offers the benefits to people on Earth, and we will only see those if we continue to make the investments that we're making and we continue to expand the scope of the space activities.
Well, thank you. My time is up, and I thank you, Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the witnesses might want to know that there's just 2 of our members that have questions left. And with that, we'll go to Representative Caraballo from Colorado.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you all for sitting through a long hearing. I'm very excited for today's hearing, especially since a couple of us actually just got to meet with NASA astronaut Frank Rubio, who is currently orbiting the Earth on the International Space Station, and so that was a wonderful experience. Colorado, unknown to many people, is a national leader in space exploration and research. We're actually the nation's 2nd largest aerospace economy, and we rank 1st in the nation for aerospace employment concentration. Additionally, Colorado is home to one of 12 FAA commercial spaceports in the U.S. that can support horizontal launch and landing operations. As some of you may know, in 1994, Congress authorized the Space Transportation Infrastructure Matching Program to provide federal support for the development of a domestic commercial spaceport network. Now, unfortunately, only a small handful of STEM grants were distributed between 2010 and 12, and the program has not been appropriated since then, despite a significant increase in the demand for space transportation services. Ms. Drees, as someone who has run a spaceport before, can you please speak to the need for Congress to reauthorize and reappropriate the STEM program in order to support civil, commercial, and defense missions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And I completely agree. And having run a spaceport myself, I can tell you how difficult it is sometimes to be able to get some of those, the grant funds to allow companies to continue innovating in that environment. When I was in Mojave, it was 10 years ago when we got a STEM grant. Shortly after that, the program was defunded, or I guess not funded again. It is absolutely critical. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is we have a network of nationwide commercial spaceports that can really support the things that are happening even at the federal ranges. So there is definitely a capacity problem that we're experiencing at the ranges, and our nation's network of commercial spaceports can help really fill that gap. So it is really important that we see a grant program established for these commercial spaceports so that we can continue to allow these operations. A lot of testing happens at these commercial spaceports as well, which is really important to the development of the entire industry. So we see the opportunity for commercial spaceports across the country to really help establish that part of the industry.
And more specifically, how important is building resilient spaceport infrastructure to maintaining technological competitiveness over our adversaries?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do see that as a critical component of having a national spaceport strategy of sorts to have a lot of different capabilities around the country. This is something even that DARPA has been very interested in making sure we have some sort of resilient launch capability or launch system here in the U.S. There are a lot of spaceports, but every spaceport has its sort of unique characteristics. So having those capabilities across the country is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Great points there. Shifting orbits, I want to talk briefly about remote sensing. It continues to be more and more important for our society, and its uses continue to grow. Our own government relies on commercial imagery for national security missions and civil applications. And in fact, in my district, there's a company that is based there whose remote sensing work has helped tell the story of Ukraine, of the conflict in Ukraine, in ways that we haven't been able to do before. So, Ms. Drees, again for you, you mentioned in your testimony the need for additional transparency and definitions for remote sensing regulations. Can you please elaborate on the need for continuing review of the regulatory environment for remote sensing?
Thank you so much. Yes. We do see some sort of regulatory reform at NOAA as absolutely critical, and Ms. Schenewerk can probably fill in anything that I might miss here. So the challenge that I think that we're dealing with is a lot of the systems that were created long ago didn't really expect to see the industry as it's grown and developed into today. So the reforms that need to happen are really meant to help sort of speed up the process. And that's the challenge that a lot of the satellite companies have, is the length of time that it takes to actually get their asset up into space, which is very detrimental to small companies that are relying on that one single asset to keep their companies alive. So the streamlining process kind of involves keeping industry very much engaged along with the regulator to make sure that there's transparency along the way. If there are challenges with the application, those challenges should be communicated back to the company immediately versus, having a complete, form back to the company with a lot of things that could have been answered along the way. So that's one of the things that we're recommending.
Yeah, I'll just add that one of the pieces that really is important in the conversation about remote sensing capabilities and the licensing is how those conditions that are placed on licenses, especially for more sophisticated systems, right? So if you're a tier 1 system, maybe it's not so bad, but if you're a tier 2 or tier 3 and you have conditions, whether those conditions expire over time, have clear indicators for when you can move past those and not face those conditions, because that is the challenge of having to get a license and then go back and adjudicate the conditions on your license, where you might be able to open up a market, might be able to service a customer, might be able to provide humanitarian support that is limited by virtue of that condition that perhaps is overtaken by events.
Thank you both so much, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for extending my time.
The young lady yields back, and now we go to Florida with Representative Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. NASA has launched Dreams, Careers, Technologies, and has helped with the expanding private space industry. And there's a lot of symmetry here. Public university researchers are now mainly launching their experiments from private satellites. But the increasing number of launches, there are hazards. Some fear that it could create a zero-G Wild West. And Dr. Koller, I agree with you, and it seems like you seem to reject this binary choice that folks sometimes will have us to believe that there's either no regulation or crazy amount of regulation, and you seem to reject that tug of war between regulation and no regulation. You say we should focus on a comprehensive approach to safety with both government and industry taking initiative to solve these problems. I'm curious, what are some of the threats to safety that you see, and also how has the industry stepped up to solve them, and where has it fallen short?
So I think, excuse me, I think there could be a distinction being made between are the missions purely robotic or are actually people involved. And I think different paradigms could apply to those, right? If the life and safety of an individual on board is directly at risk. And so for those, I think, for those types of missions, I think we need to take lessons learned from other sectors and implement the right tools, the right mechanisms, and develop a more collaborative approach, not an adversarial approach between regulator and industry, but a collaborative approach that is taking into account people's culture, data collection, various different mechanisms, including international transparency and collaboration. And I think if we are able to build a more comprehensive safety management system in a collaborative way, I think that is our chance to actually gradually improve and reduce the risks that are involved.
Thank you. And there are many industries that have great relationships between regulators and the industry. And I think now that we're at this beginning phase, we have an opportunity to make this one of those. Last fall, the Biden administration announced their first cislunar science and technology strategy. Mr. Dunstan, when you say we need to be good stewards of the cislunar system, what does that mean to you?
Well, for me, it means that we have to recognize that, especially the orbits around Earth, everyone uses, and so everyone is responsible for them, and so we have to do our part to be responsible to not clog them up with too much junk. And I think because of our ability to innovate so rapidly, we should be at the forefront of developing remediation efforts, technologies that we can actually bring down. And there have been some really excellent studies as to where the worst ones are. We can identify sort of the worst bodies that are up there, and if we can develop the technologies to bring them down, we actually are being good stewards and are helping the world as a whole.
Thank you. I want this industry to continue to grow and thrive, especially in Florida, where we have over 150,000 jobs in aerospace and counting. And as a former cadet major in the Civil Air Patrol, I used to fly gliders out of Merritt Island. Aerospace has a very special place in my heart. My district has some of the worst income inequality in the country, and I think young people equipped for good-paying STEM jobs can help provide a local solution to the income wealth inequality we see, especially in Central Florida. I've met with many STEM-obsessed students across my district, which constantly bring up the great programs that they hear about and have done through NASA that has helped them continue to spark and motivate them to be involved in STEM. Ms. Drees, how have members of the Commercial Spaceflight Federation engaged in efforts to promote STEM education in the workforce?
That's a really important point for our industry, and I appreciate the question. Many of our members are not only very interested in this topic, are hiring, students out of university to fill the jobs, but they're motivating and inspiring kids even as young as kindergarten to get interested in space and science and technology, in hopes that we can kind of start recruiting from a very young age these next generation of scientists and engineers that the industry so desperately needs, not only a space industry, but really across many industries. So it is a very critical component, like workforce development in terms of what's happening in the commercial space industry. We're also, many of our members are partnering with the National Space Council in their efforts in STEM initiatives as well. So it's absolutely a critical aspect of the industry.
Thank you. And Ms. Schenewerk? Okay, perfect. Based on your experience, how can Congress help with workforce development in the commercial space sector?
So I think that the programs that the Congress supports through NASA, the education programs, I think thinking, of course, about how our education system supports schools across the nation, particularly schools that are at most in need, is important. But, I think in terms of engaging with the industry, the more that Congress engages in a meaningful way and has meaningful conversations about the importance of the industry, the exciting aspects of the industry, that helps, right? So yes, when we have a bad day, that could get a lot of attention, but even more important is when we have really good days, like the day that we launched Americans from American soil for the first time in a decade. So those are the kinds of opportunities to highlight what this industry is accomplishing, to make sure that students that are really young know that they are our futures in the industry and that there's a whole host of capabilities, right? Technicians, welders, truck drivers, to aerospace engineers and astronauts. We hire all of those folks, even lawyers. So I think that's an important point to engage meaningful and to talk about the positive potential of the industry.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. The first rocket launch, I've seen rocket launches my entire life from my backyard. But my first one I actually did at Kennedy Space Center was just a few months ago. It was for the Tempo rocket launch, which was NASA technology on a private rocket, and I think it shows that there's great room for collaboration here. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. We want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony, and we appreciate the members' questions. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and the written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.